Hey guys, tonight we're going to wander back into a world where fruit wasn't just a snack you grabbed out of the fridge, it was survival prestige, and sometimes the punchline of very bad medieval jokes. You're stepping into the frosty winter of the Middle Ages, when orchards looked barren, your belly growled with hunger, and the one thing standing between you and starvation was a wrinkled little fruit that looked like it had gone bad. Yep, I'm talking about the Medlar. And before you wrinkle your nose, let me tell you, people used to lose their minds over this. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, tell me in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is. Nothing more fun than finding out someone's hearing this at 3 a.m. on the other side of the planet. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You trudge across a snow-covered path, boots crunching on frozen mud. It's bleak grey, and the fields are silent, except for a few crows circling overhead. Everything looks dead. But then you spot a tree, bare branches holding a few stubborn fruits, clinging like forgotten ornaments. Small, brown, and definitely not Instagram-worthy, these are Meddlers. And here's the catch, you can't just pluck them and eat them. Fresh off the tree, they're as hard as little stones and taste like chewing a sour stick of chalk. Instead, medieval farmers had to let them blet. That's a fancy word for rot a little. You'd pick them after the first frost, lay them out in a cool storeroom, and wait until their skin wrinkled, their flesh softened, and they looked like the kind of fruit your mum would throw in the trash. Only then could you scoop the inside out with a spoon and taste something magical, a flavor like apple butter, mixed with dates, cinnamon, and wine. It was nature's way of saying, trust the process. And trust me, they did. Meddlers were nicknamed open-arse fruit because, well, let's just say, the shape gave medieval jokesters plenty of low-hanging comedy material. Even Shakespeare got in on the fun. But while playwrights were laughing, regular folks were grateful because this ugly little survivor brought sweetness when almost nothing else grew. You're huddled inside a timber cottage now, the smell of smoke in the air. A bowl of Meddlers sits on the table, half sunken and wrinkled. You pick one up, split the skin and spoon out the pulp. It's rich, jammy, and surprisingly complex for something that looks like compost. For peasants who spent the winter eating rye bread hard enough to chip teeth, a Medlar was like tasting dessert after months of famine food. Here's a fun fact, Meddlers have been cultivated in Europe for over 3,000 years. The Romans adored them, planting trees wherever their legions marched. They spread across Gaul into Britain and into monastery gardens. By the Middle Ages, Meddlers had become a staple winter fruit, often stored alongside apples and pears in straw-lined cellars. Historians still argue whether Meddlers were valued more for their taste or their timing. Because what good is a sweet apple if it rots before December? Quirky tidbit, some medieval folks believed Meddlers had medicinal powers. Eat them unripe and they were supposed to help with diarrhea. Eat them bletted and they were thought to comfort the stomach and settle your humors. In a world where doctors prescribed leeches for headaches, that actually wasn't the worst advice. Now picture this, a noble's feast in a great hall. Roasted boar on the spit, trenchers of bread, piled with stews, goblets of spiced wine, and for dessert, a platter of Meddlers. Lords and ladies nibble them delicately, while the jester cracks yet another open-arse joke. Highborn or lowborn, everyone ate Meddlers because they filled a gap in the seasonal calendar. But the fruit had an image problem. Unlike figs or pomegranates, which looked exotic and glamorous, Meddlers were squat and brown. They became symbols of decay in literature. Chaucer compared old age to a rotting Medlar, yet at the same time people couldn't resist them. That contradiction made them unforgettable. You wander into a monastery garden, the air crisp with winter silence. Rows of bare branches line the walls, and a monk in a rough wool habit gathers Meddlers into a basket. In places like this, Meddlers weren't just food. They were security. Stored properly, they could last into the darkest days of February, when other supplies had long since dwindled. In fact, some medieval families relied on them the same way we rely on canned goods in a pantry. Imagine being a child in that time. No candy bars, no hot cocoa. Instead, your winter treat is a Medlar soft and brown spooned out like jelly. You might complain, but you'd also learn quickly that this strange little fruit meant survival. And let's be honest, if hipster cafes today rediscovered Meddlers, you'd be paying $15 for artisanal Medlar jam on sourdough toast. Medieval peasants would laugh at us for turning their survival food into a luxury. The cultural footprint of Meddlers was surprisingly wide. Shakespeare dropped them into Romeo and Juliet, where Mercutio joked about their suggestive shape. Chaucer mentioned them in bawdy tales. Even centuries later, Victorian gardeners still planted them in English orchards, a living reminder of medieval taste. Historians still argue whether the decline of Meddlers came from changing palates or the rise of apples and pears that stored better with new techniques. Either way, their legacy is stubborn. The next time you bite into something sweet in the middle of winter, you're tasting a modern echo of what Meddlers once gave the promise that even in the harshest season, patience could turn rot into richness. And as you drift to sleep tonight, picture that a quiet cottage snow outside a bowl of wrinkled little fruits waiting on the table. They look like nothing, but they carry history in every bite. You push open the creaky gate of a medieval orchard. Behind you, the sound of sheep bells fades as the evening wind stirs the branches. Among rows of apple and pear trees, you notice a stranger, a tall, slightly wild-looking tree with clusters of small, reddish-brown fruits. They look like shrunken crab apples, but tougher, harder, and oddly defiant against the chill. This is the service tree, and its fruit, called Sorb Apples, was one of the most respected but now forgotten treasures of medieval Europe. Here's the thing, Sorb Apples weren't your average juicy snack. Fresh off the tree, they were practically inedible, hard, sour, and mouth-puckering in a way that made you regret biting into them. But just like Meddlers, Sorb Apples had a secret time transformed them. Farmers picked them in late autumn, tucked them into straw, or laid them out in cool storerooms and waited. After weeks of slow softening, the fruit finally gave way, turning into something edible. Sweet, tangy, almost like spiced cider jelly. Medieval farmers adored Sorb Apples for one simple reason: survival. Unlike cherries which spoiled within days or plums that shriveled fast, Sorb apples clung to usefulness long into winter. You could store them through December and even January, pulling them out when everything else in the pantry had gone stale. In a world without refrigeration that was gold, the Romans knew this. They considered the service tree valuable enough to spread across their empire, planting it near roads, villas, and military camps. They fermented Sorb apples into a tart, cider-like drink that may have been a precursor to some European liquors. Archaeologists even found carbonized sorb seeds in Roman sites, proof that this tough little fruit traveled widely. When the legions withdrew, the monks stepped in tending service trees in cloistered orchards and writing recipes for sorb conserves in Latin manuscripts. But sorb apples weren't just food, they carried symbolism. Their stubborn durability, tough skin, late ripening, long storage became a metaphor for resilience. In medieval herbal texts, sorb fruits were said to comfort the stomach and help with digestion. Some physicians believed they could balance the humors, cooling excess heat in the body. And yes, once again, people turned unripe sorb fruits into remedies for diarrhea. You're starting to notice a trend. If it puckered your mouth, medieval doctors thought it cured stomach troubles. Now imagine you're a peasant in late December. Snow drifts against the walls of your wattle and daub cottage, and your food stores are thin. The rye bread is hard as stone, the salted pork dwindling. But in the corner, nestled in straw, are a few baskets of sorb apples. You pluck one soft and yielding and bite in. The flavor is sharp but honeyed, earthy and warming. That moment isn't just eating, it's reassurance. Somehow your ancestors planted something that would carry you through the leanest months. Sorb apples were in many ways the fruit of patience. They weren't flashy, and they didn't sell themselves with sweetness right off the branch. You had to trust them, wait for them, and let them surprise you. Maybe that's why they suited the medieval rhythm of life so well. After all, this was an age of slow seasons, hard winters, and the necessity of endurance. If you walked through a medieval marketplace, you might not immediately notice sorb apples among the baskets of more familiar produce, but they were there quietly waiting for those who knew their worth. Unlike figs or dates, which traveled in from warmer lands and cost dearly, sorb apples were local, humble, and grown in the rugged corners of Europe, where little else could thrive. One fascinating detail is how sorb apples crossed social boundaries. They weren't reserved solely for the elite, but they also weren't considered poor man's food. Farmers valued them for sustenance. Nobles prized them for their role in refined drinks. Some estate records mention sorb ciders served at winter banquets, described as bittersweet and almost warming, like a rustic cousin to wine. This dual identity, peasant, survival fruit, and aristocratic delicacy, made the service tree rare among medieval crops. The trees themselves were demanding. Service trees could take decades to mature, sometimes 40 to 50 years, before yielding real harvests. That's not something an impatient farmer would gamble on unless he was thinking of his grandchildren. Planting a service tree was an act of faith. You might never drink cider from its fruit, but your descendants could. For this reason, the tree carried a kind of symbolic weight in rural culture. It was about continuity, patience, and family legacy. There's also a touch of folklore. In some regions, sorb apples were believed to ward off misfortune. Branches were planted near farmhouses, supposedly to protect the animals. A few legends even hint that eating sorb fruit could make you strong enough to resist curses or witchcraft. This might sound like superstition, but remember, in a world where survival was fragile, anything that lasted through winter felt magical. Culinary uses went beyond raw fruit. People baked sorb apples into pies with honey or simmered them with grains to make a kind of porridge thickened by their natural starch. The fruit's astringency meant it paired well with fatty meats like goose or pork, much like how we use cranberry sauce today. Monks sometimes boiled sorb fruits down into a concentrated syrup, both as medicine and as a sweetener. Some accounts even mention dried sorb fruits ground into flour to stretch bread in times of famine. Imagine biting into a rough medieval loaf with a hint of tart sweetness. That's the service tree's contribution to survival cuisine. And then, of course, there was the alcohol. Sorb cider wasn't bubbly like the crisp apple ciders we think of today. It was thicker, darker, more tannic, closer to a rustic wine. In fact, in parts of Central Europe, farmers fermented sorb apples alongside pears or crab apples to add depth and complexity to their drinks. These concoctions weren't just beverages. They were social glue shared at festivals, weddings, and the darkest nights of winter. Drinking sorb cider was a reminder that even harsh fruits could transform into something joyous with patience and craft. Despite its resilience, the service tree always remained a minority crop. It wasn't easy to propagate, and its slow growth didn't suit the short-term mindset of expanding medieval agriculture. By the late Middle Ages, as trade routes widened and new fruits arrived from abroad, citrus from the Mediterranean, sugar-rich figs, and raisins, the sorb apple slowly lost its prominence. Why wait 40 years for a tree to bear fruit when you could buy imported luxuries? But before it faded, it left its mark. The sorb apple taught generations the value of endurance. It bridged the gap between need and refinement, between peasant and noble, between patience and reward. And while we might barely recognize the fruit today, medieval farmers saw it as a quiet ally in the war against hunger. Today, the service tree is nearly forgotten, surviving mostly in scattered patches across Europe. In Germany and Austria, a few regions still preserve orchards of sorb trees, making small batches of traditional schnapps or cider from the fruit. In Italy, you might find rare mentions of sorbo in old recipe books. But outside these pockets, most people wouldn't know a sorb apple if it dropped on their head. This raises the question, should sorb apples make a comeback? The answer might surprise you. Modern agriculture obsessed with fast yields and mass production largely ignores slow, stubborn trees. Yet, in an age of climate change and biodiversity loss, the service tree's very qualities, resilience, hardiness, ability to thrive in poor soil, could be its greatest strengths. Unlike delicate commercial apples that demand constant care, sorb trees can handle neglect, drought, and shifting temperatures. Nutritionally too, Sorb apples deserve attention. They're rich in tannins, vitamin C, and antioxidants. Modern food science might confirm what medieval healers already suspected: these fruits have real health benefits. Their astringent compounds could support digestion, their vitamins strengthen immunity, and their natural sugars provide energy without the overwhelming sweetness of modern fruits. In other words, Sorb apples are an ancient superfood hiding in plain sight. Culturally reviving Sorb apples would reconnect us with a deeper rhythm of life. Imagine community orchards where service trees are planted not for quick profit, but as gifts to future generations. Imagine local festivals celebrating the first Sorb harvest with cider brewing competitions and rustic pies. These traditions wouldn't just be about food, they'd be about restoring patience, heritage, and the long view of farming. There's also an aesthetic charm. Service trees are striking in the landscape, with broad crowns, sturdy trunks, and blossoms that draw pollinators in spring. For medieval farmers, they weren't just functional, they were beautiful. Planting them again could enrich rural scenery while helping biodiversity. But perhaps the strongest argument for bringing them back is the story they carry. Every fruit has a tale, but Sorb apples embody something profoundly human: the ability to wait. We live in an era of instant gratification, yet here's a fruit that insists on slowness. It refuses to reward you until you've given it time. That lesson resonates far beyond orchards. It's about resilience in hard times, about trusting the future, about the sweetness that comes only after endurance. So picture this: a medieval farmer in the 12th century planting a sapling he knows will not bear fruit in his lifetime. He digs, he waters, he tends it, and he leaves it for his children. 800 years later, a handful of these trees still stand in forgotten corners of Europe. Their fruits drop to the ground unnoticed, fermenting back into the soil. They've outlasted empires, plagues, wars, and famines. And they wait still for someone to remember their worth. Maybe it's time we listened. Maybe it's time we picked up a wrinkled, softened Sorb apple bit into its strange, honeyed flesh and tasted the patience of history. Among the strangest fruits you'd find in a medieval orchard was the Medlar. At first glance, it hardly looks edible, small, brown, and wrinkled, with a blossom end that resembles rather awkwardly a miniature star-shaped mouth. Many travelers described it less politely, giving it nicknames that compared it to less dignified parts of the body. Yet despite its appearance, the medlar held a special place in medieval diets, especially when the frosts of winter stripped the land of fresh produce. The medlar's magic lies in its ripening process, something the medieval world called bletting. When picked, medlars are hard, sour, and almost impossible to eat. But after being stored for weeks in straw or cool cellars, they soften, darken, and turn into a sweet custard-like pulp. What began as an unpromising lump of bitterness transformed into a delicacy of caramelized flavor. To medieval farmers and townsfolk alike, the medlar symbolized patience, rewarded a fruit that had to decay before it could be enjoyed. This unusual process fascinated medieval writers. Geoffrey Chaucer in the Canterbury Tales referenced the medlar as a metaphor for ripening late in life. Shakespeare, too, used it in his plays sometimes with bawdy humour, sometimes as a poetic symbol for transformation. Clearly, the fruit wasn't just food. It became a cultural touchstone, a reminder that beauty and sweetness often arrive only after hardship and age. Culinarily, medlars were versatile. They could be eaten raw after letting their pulp scooped out with a spoon. Housewives transformed them into jams, jellies, and pastes, spreadable sweetness that brightened dark winter days. Some recipes mixed medlars with honey or wine, producing rich sauces for roasted meats. In a society where sugar was rare and expensive, medlars were one of the few reliable sources of natural sweetness deep into winter. Medicinally, they earned equal respect. Physicians of the medieval world believed medlars aided digestion, treated diarrhea, and cooled fevers. Monks cultivated them in cloisters, noting their usefulness as a gentle laxative or as a calming food for the sick. In an age of limited medicine, the fruit's soothing properties gave it value far beyond taste. Farmers also appreciated medlars for their resilience. The trees were hardy, surviving cold winters and growing well in the poor soils of northern Europe. They didn't need delicate care like figs or peaches. Once established, a medlar tree could provide fruit for generations. Small wonder that monasteries, manors, and peasant gardens alike often included them. Still, the medlar's reputation was mixed. Some saw it as a blessing, a fruit of endurance and transformation. Others mocked its homely appearance and awkward associations. But whether celebrated or scorned, it never went unnoticed. The medlar's presence in medieval life was too distinct, too unusual to ignore. And perhaps that was its true charm. It was a fruit that defied first impressions. You had to trust it, to wait for it, to allow it to change. In that way, the medlar mirrored the rhythms of medieval life itself, a world where patience, endurance, and transformation were keys to survival. To understand how central the medlar was to medieval culture, one only has to look at the calendar. By late autumn, most fruits had been harvested and stored. Apples and pears could last for weeks, but even the best varieties began to shrivel and sour. Grapes were long gone, dried as raisins or pressed into wine. Citrus fruits were rare imports available only to the wealthy. And so as December approached, fresh fruit became almost a memory. This was where the medlar shone. Picked in November and stored properly, it wasn't ready to eat until Christmas or even New Year. Families would gather around their meager winter meals, and out would come the medlars, soft and brown but richly sweet. For many, they were the only fresh fruit of the season, a taste of luxury in the bleakest months. Their role in festivals was especially important. In parts of France and England, medlars were served as treats during Yuletide feasts. Some households preserved medlar pulp in spiced wine, creating a warming dessert not unlike mulled jelly. Others dried the pulp into chewy cakes, portable and long-lasting, something a traveller or pilgrim might carry on long journeys. The medlar was also tied to ideas of fertility and rebirth. Because it ripened only after rotting, it became a symbol of renewal of life emerging from decay. Medieval poets often played on this paradox, comparing human love aging and even the cycle of death and resurrection to the medlar's strange transformation. In this way, the fruit carried both practical and spiritual weight, bridging the gap between kitchen and chapel. Interestingly, the medlar wasn't just for eating. Its wood, though not large in supply, was hard and fine-grained, suitable for small tools, pegs, and even parts of crossbows. Farmers valued the tree not only for its fruit, but for its utility, making it a practical addition to a mixed orchard. One detail often overlooked today is how medlars fit into medieval trade networks. While commoners grew them in small plots, larger estates sometimes produced surpluses for sale. Town records from England and France mention medlars sold alongside apples and nuts in winter markets. They weren't the most glamorous offering, but they filled a niche, something unique to brighten cold months when choices were few. It's also worth noting how democratic the medlar was. Unlike figs or pomegranates, which were luxuries for the elite medlars, could be enjoyed by anyone with patience. Peasants gathered them from hedgerows. Nobles cultivated them in orchards. Though recipes might vary by class, the wealthy simmering them in spiced wine, the poor eating them plain, the fruit crossed social boundaries in a way that few others did. As the centuries passed, however, tastes shifted. The Renaissance brought a flood of new imports: oranges, peaches, apricots. Sugar became more common, reshaping palates towards sweeter, brighter flavors. Against such competition, the humble medlar faded. Its odd looks and reliance on bletting seemed old-fashioned, a relic of a harsher time. By the 19th century, it had become a curiosity grown in a few rural areas, but largely forgotten in cities. Yet even in decline, the medlar lingered in memory. Old poems and proverbs kept its reputation alive, and a handful of country households still treasured it as a seasonal delicacy. Its strange charm refused to disappear entirely, like a ghost of the medieval orchard, whispering across centuries. So why should we care about the medlar today? At first glance, it might seem like an odd candidate for revival. It doesn't look appealing in supermarkets, it demands storage time, and it requires a shift in how we think about fruit. Yet these very qualities may be exactly why it deserves a second chance. In a world obsessed with perfection, shiny apples, flawless bananas, neatly packaged strawberries, the medlar offers something radically different. It reminds us that food doesn't have to be immediate or conventionally beautiful. It can be slow, strange, and surprising. Eating a medlar is not just consumption. It's an experience of waiting, of transformation, of discovering sweetness where none seemed possible. From an ecological perspective, medlars also have advantages. They are hardy trees tolerant of poor soils and resistant to many pests. They don't demand the heavy spraying of chemicals that modern fruit farming often relies on. Their late-season ripening could fill an ecological gap, providing food for birds and insects when other fruits are gone. In permaculture designs, they fit beautifully as resilient, low-maintenance trees. Culinary innovation could also revive them. Chefs are beginning to rediscover medlars, experimenting with them in chutneys, ice creams, craft beers, and even cocktails. Their flavor, somewhere between apple butter, date, and wine, is unlike anything else. Imagine a holiday dessert of medlar tart with spiced cream, or a farmhouse ale infused with bletted fruit. Far from being outdated, the medlar could become a star of modern gastronomy precisely because it is unique. Culturally, the medlar invites us to reconnect with forgotten rhythms. Our ancestors understood seasonality in a way we rarely do. They knew the joy of waiting months for a fruit to ripen, the celebration of its arrival, the appreciation of its fleeting presence. Reviving medlars isn't just about agriculture. It's about reviving patience, anticipation, and respect for time. There's also a poetic justice in bringing back a fruit that literature so richly adorned. To taste a medlar is to taste the world of Chaucer and Shakespeare, to bite into a symbol that carried both humor and wisdom. It's not just food, it's history you can hold in your hand. And finally, there's the sheer delight of surprise. Offer someone a medlar today, and chances are they've never heard of it. Watch their skepticism as they see its wrinkled skin. Then let them taste the soft, spiced pulp and watch their expression change. That small act of rediscovery carries joy, a reminder that the world still holds forgotten wonders waiting to be found. So perhaps the medlar should not remain a relic of the medieval past. Perhaps it should be planted again in orchards, gardens, and parks as both food and story. It may never dominate supermarket shelves, but it could thrive in local farms, farmers' markets, and kitchens willing to embrace its eccentric charm. The medieval world relied on the medlar when the nights were long and the cupboards bare. It offered sweetness when sweetness seemed impossible. That lesson remains as valuable now as it was 600 years ago. Sometimes the greatest rewards come to those who wait. In the heart of a medieval village not far from the bustle of the market square, there might stand a broad, low tree with leaves like little hearts and berries that stained fingers a deep purple. This was the mulberry tree, a plant with a dual-purpose food for humans and fuel for one of the most mysterious and luxurious medieval trades, silk production. Mulberries were prized because they connected the ordinary with the extraordinary. On the one hand, peasants and children loved the sweet, juicy fruits that ripened in summer, bursting with sugar and staining their lips and tunics. They were eaten fresh, dried, or boiled down into syrups and wines. On the other hand, the leaves of the white mulberry were the sole diet of silkworms. Where mulberry trees grew in abundance, so too did the possibility of spinning threads finer than anything a commoner could imagine wearing. Europe's relationship with mulberries began long before the medieval era. The Romans had planted them widely, but their true significance came when silk trickled westward along trade routes from China. By the Middle Ages, silk had become a symbol of status, wealth, and divine favor, adorning bishops, kings, and noble women. For most peasants, mulberries meant little more than food, but for the wealthy, planting mulberries was a statement. It was a gamble on tapping into the luxurious world of silk production. Still, the fruit itself played a bigger role in everyday life than we might assume. Mulberries, rich in vitamins and natural sugars, were among the few fruits that could be transformed into both comfort food and medicine. Healers recommended mulberry juice as a remedy for sore throats, fevers, and even mouth ulcers. Boiled into a thick syrup, it became a medieval version of cough medicine. Physicians also valued its cooling effect, believing it balanced the body's hot humors during summer. Culturally, mulberries were wrapped in symbolism. In medieval poetry, their dark staining juice was often compared to blood, sometimes representing passion, sometimes tragedy. Geoffrey Chaucer, William Shakespeare, and later Renaissance poets would all draw on the imagery of mulberries to talk about love loss and the inevitability of time. But in the 12th or 13th century, when a farmer plucked the first ripe berry of summer, the meaning was far simpler. Here was sweetness at last after a long and grueling winter. For farmers, mulberries were also dependable. The trees grew strong, often living for centuries, with roots deep enough to withstand drought. Once planted, a mulberry could feed generations. It wasn't just fruit, it was legacy. And though they lacked the glamour of imported oranges or figs, they were profoundly woven into the fabric of medieval sustenance. By the time twilight fell on a summer day, a peasant child might come home with stained hands and a full stomach from raiding the mulberry tree, while somewhere far away, a noblewoman admired a shimmering bolt of silk woven thanks to the same plant. Mulberries bridged worlds, the humble and the exalted, the field and the throne room. The deeper you look into medieval life, the more the mulberry emerges as a tree of many uses, not just a fruit source. Farmers valued its wood nearly as much as its berries. Tough yet flexible mulberry wood was used to make tools, baskets, and even furniture that could withstand daily wear. In coastal towns, its resistance to rot made it ideal for boat parts and fishing equipment. This meant that even if a family never touched the fruit, they might still rely on the tree indirectly to support their livelihood. But it was the silk connection that gave the mulberry an almost mythical reputation. In southern Europe, especially in Italy and later France, rulers encouraged the planting of white mulberries in an attempt to establish a domestic silk industry. Monasteries often played a key role in this effort. Monks carefully raised silkworms, feeding them mulberry leaves, then spun the cocoons into threads of unimaginable fineness. Silk garments were sometimes so costly that they equaled the value of a farm. To wear silk was to wear a visible badge of superiority. Yet mulberries also had a darker side. The berries' tendency to stain meant they were associated with permanence and the inability to erase sins or passions. In folklore, mulberry juice represented blood spilled unjustly. One of the most famous medieval retellings of this theme came through the Roman tale of Pyramus and Thisbe, whose tragic love supposedly turned the white mulberry fruit dark red after they died beneath its branches. This story circulated in Europe through Ovid's Metamorphoses and took on a life of its own in medieval romances, reinforcing the fruit's image as a witness to sorrow and forbidden love. Still, for ordinary households, symbolism gave way to practicality. Mulberries could be made into wines, jams and syrups that brightened meals, otherwise dominated by bread and pottage. Because of their strong pigmentation, they were also used as a natural dye, turning fabrics, pastries, and even medicines a deep purple. A baker might mix mulberry juice into dough to give it color, while a physician might use it to make a potion look more potent. Mulberry trees also symbolize stability in ways that went beyond the material. A single tree could feed countless mouths, and its wide branches provided shade in hot summers. Families often planted them near homes, and they became part of the landscape of community life. Children climbed them, couples courted under them, and travelers rested in their shade. In that sense, the mulberry was less an exotic delicacy and more a quiet companion of medieval existence. It's easy to imagine a summer feast where, after days of salted fish and coarse bread bowls of freshly gathered mulberries were set on the table. The taste, sharp, sweet staining was a reminder that nature still had surprises to offer, even for those who lived close to the edge of survival. For peasants, it was an indulgence they didn't need to buy, a moment of sweetness granted freely by the land. By the late Middle Ages, the reputation of mulberries reached a turning point. Kings and city-states realized that the humble fruit might underpin entire economic revolutions. In Italy, cities like Florence and Lucca invested heavily in silk production, and mulberry groves became almost as valuable as vineyards. Landowners discovered that cultivating mulberries could secure profits not from the fruit itself, but from the delicate silkworms they sustained. This ambition spread. In France, King Louis XI in the 15th century and later King Henri IV in the 16th century would attempt large-scale mulberry planting campaigns to strengthen their domestic silk industries. Though this timeline pushes us slightly beyond the medieval into the early modern era, the roots were laid much earlier. The dream of silk, a fabric softer than wool, shinier than linen, and lighter than velvet, was inseparable from the presence of the mulberry tree. But the story of mulberries is not just about luxury. For poorer folk, the berries continued to be cherished as folk medicine. They were believed to strengthen gums, purify the blood, and cure digestive troubles. Recipes for mulberry cordials and tonics appear in herbal manuscripts alongside remedies using sage mint and honey. Some even claimed that mulberry juice could drive away evil humors when applied to the skin. Whether these cures truly worked or not, they highlight how deeply woven the mulberry was into the fabric of daily health. The symbolism of the mulberry also deepened in religious thought. Christian writers sometimes described the mulberry as a tree of patience, since its fruits appeared late in the season, resisting early frost. The tree's ability to delay budding until spring was fully established became a metaphor for wisdom and careful timing, a lesson medieval monks saw as spiritual guidance. Unfortunately, as Europe transitioned into the Renaissance and beyond, mulberries began to fade from common diets. Apples, pears, and plums dominated orchards, while imported fruits like oranges and lemons grew in prestige. Mulberries, though once widely known, gradually slipped into obscurity outside regions that continued silk production. The very trait that made them remarkable, the staining juice, the soft flesh that spoiled quickly, also made them less appealing for large-scale commerce. They were hard to store, hard to transport, and impossible to polish into the kind of fruit that dazzled markets. And so a tree that once fed peasants inspired poets, healed the sick, and fueled an entire luxury industry receded into the background. Today you might walk through Europe and stumble upon an ancient mulberry tree still standing by a farmhouse or monastery wall, silent evidence of its former importance. Its branches may still bear fruit, staining the ground purple each summer, but few stop to taste it. If there's a lesson in the story of mulberries, it is this. Some of the most transformative plants in history were not those that dazzled with rarity, but those that quietly supported countless lives across centuries. The mulberry was never just a fruit, it was a bridge between the poor and the rich, between the natural and the luxurious, between survival and splendor. If mulberries were celebrated as versatile and nurturing, barberries were remembered with suspicion, fear, and sometimes outright hostility. To medieval farmers, this small thorny shrub with clusters of bright red berries was both a blessing and a curse. On the one hand, it produced tart, vitamin-rich fruit that could liven up stews, wines, and preserves at a time when diets were notoriously bland. On the other hand, it carried a dark agricultural reputation. Barberries were linked to crop blight and famine. The fruit itself was remarkable. Unlike apples or pears, barberries were tiny, just a few millimeters long, but packed with a sour, almost lemon-like flavor. In an age when citrus fruits were scarce or prohibitively expensive outside southern Europe, barberries filled the gap. They provided a natural souring agent, giving cooks the acidity they needed for sauces and marinades. In medieval recipe collections, especially those influenced by Middle Eastern cuisine through the Crusades, barberries appeared in sauces for poultry or as a garnish for rich meat dishes. They balanced fatty flavors and reminded the eater of sunnier climates far away. But while households valued the berries, farmers dreaded the shrubs. Long before modern science, people noticed that wheat and barley fields near barberry bushes often fell victim to strange diseases. Entire harvests could be destroyed by rust, a fungal infection that blackened stalks and ruined grain. To peasants whose lives depended on bread, this was no small inconvenience. It was the difference between survival and starvation. And so a story grew. The barberry was not merely unlucky, it was dangerous. By the High Middle Ages, in some regions of Europe, barberry bushes were actively destroyed by law. Landowners ordered peasants to rip them from hedgerows, and in towns the shrubs were burned to protect crops. This persecution earned barberries the reputation of a botanical outlaw. Unlike mulberries or medlars, which found a home in orchards and gardens, barberries became associated with waste ground, abandoned corners, and the margins of society. Yet despite the suspicion, people did not abandon them entirely. Herbalists still valued barberries for their medicinal qualities. Medieval apothecaries claimed the berries cooled excess heat in the body, soothed sore throats, and reduced fevers. Their juice, with its bright crimson color, was prescribed as both a cooling tonic and a purgative. The bark and roots, too, were steeped into remedies for liver problems and jaundice. Physicians following Galenic traditions believed the sharpness of barberries made them ideal for restoring balance to an overheated or choleric body. In this way, the barberry embodied a contradiction. It was reviled in the fields, yet respected in the infirmary. Farmers cursed it, but physicians treasured it. And ordinary folk, they often found themselves caught in the middle, knowing that a handful of tart berries could both spice their supper and endanger their crops. The cultural symbolism of barberries in the Middle Ages reflects this tension. Where the apple stood for love, knowledge, or temptation, the barberry became a symbol of warning and bitterness. Its sharp thorns made it an emblem of protection, but also of pain. Folk sayings sometimes equated a barberry hedge with hardship to pass through. One was to invite scratches and blood. Still, there were places where the plant was embraced rather than shunned. In monasteries where herbal medicine was carefully cultivated, barberries were grown in enclosed gardens far from cereal fields. Monks dried the berries to use in syrups for winter colds or ground them into powders for digestive troubles. The tart flavor was also a useful tool in fasting diets, as it cut through the monotony of salted fish and lentils. A bitter tart taste was seen as spiritually valuable, a reminder of the sourness of sin and the cleansing power of penance. Outside the monastery, barberries often found their way into folk remedies and home recipes. Peasant women, for instance, sometimes mixed crushed barberries with honey to soothe sore throats. Others boiled them into simple syrups, believed to cool the blood during hot summers. In harsher climates where fresh fruit was rare, barberries provided vital nutrition containing not only acids, but also vitamins that helped stave off scurvy-like conditions. But no matter how useful the berries might have been, their association with grain rust kept suspicion alive. In towns and villages dependent on bread for survival, even a rumor of crop failure could spark fear. Thus, barberries were often scapegoated. If a harvest went bad, fingers pointed toward the thorny shrubs lurking on the edge of the fields. In some places, burning barberries became a ritual act of protection, not unlike exorcising evil spirits. Interestingly, this conflict mirrored the broader clash between folk knowledge and official policy. Farmers who lived with the reality of crop failure lobbied for the destruction of barberries. Physicians whose world was defined by humoral theory argued for their preservation as medicine. The result was an uneasy compromise. Barberries survived in controlled spaces like monastery gardens, but were driven out of open countryside. Despite this hostility, barberries never completely vanished from medieval diets. In wealthier households with exposure to Middle Eastern cooking traditions, especially in Crusader states or trade hubs like Venice, the berries were even considered a delicacy. Dried barberries could be imported, their sharp taste enhancing rice dishes and meats. To a nobleman who had tasted saffron and pomegranates, barberries offered another note of exotic flavor. In this sense, the fruit's identity depended heavily on context. A curse to the farmer, a cure to the healer, a treat to the noble. By the later medieval period, the reputation of barberries had settled into paradox. They were both feared and desired, rejected and cultivated. Laws against them existed, yet they continued to thrive in corners of the landscape where no law could truly reach. Their decline in Europe came less from natural obscurity than from deliberate suppression. As agricultural science advanced in the early modern era, the link between barberries and grain rust was confirmed, leading to systematic eradication campaigns in many countries. In England and France, especially barberry bushes were targeted for destruction well into the 18th and 19th centuries. The plant's outlaw image was thus cemented by centuries of blame. And yet, in some corners, traditions endured. Barberry preserves remained popular in certain regions, especially in Eastern Europe. In Poland and Russia, barberry syrups and candies were cherished well into modern times. Meanwhile, in Persia, Modern Iran barberries never lost their central role in cuisine. Medieval crusaders who first tasted Persian rice dishes flecked with red berries carried stories of their flavor home to Europe even if the plant itself remained controversial. Looking back, it's striking how much of the barberry's fate depended not on its own merits, but on the fragile relationship between humans and crops. Wheat and barley were the backbone of medieval survival, and anything that threatened them was bound to be cast as villainous. The barberry simply had the misfortune of being both useful and dangerous, nourishing and destructive. Today, modern horticulture and medicine have re-examined the barberry with fresh eyes. We now know its berries are rich in vitamin C and antioxidants. Its bark contains compounds like berberine still studied for potential health benefits. Far from being an outlaw, it is now celebrated in some circles as a superfood. But in medieval Europe, the story was far less forgiving. The lesson of the barberry is one of ambivalence and resilience. While other forgotten fruits faded from memory because they were replaced or outcompeted, the barberry was actively fought against, yet it never disappeared entirely. Its bright red berries, sharp taste, and thorny branches ensured it remained visible, an eternal reminder of how fragile medieval agriculture was, and how quickly necessity could turn to suspicion. In many ways, the barberry's medieval story is as much about human psychology as it is about plants. It shows how communities desperate to explain misfortune could project fear onto a shrub, and how the same fruit could be condemned in one field and praised in another. For peasants, it symbolized danger. For monks, humility and cure. For nobles, exotic pleasure. That spectrum of meanings makes the barberry one of the most fascinating of the forgotten fruits, at once reviled and revered. If there was ever a fruit that embodied the strangeness of medieval diets, it was the Medlar Misspylus germanica. At first glance, it hardly looked appetizing, a small brown apple-like fruit, with a rough skin and a curious gaping crown on its base that made it resemble rather crudely the human body. Its nickname in England was blunt and unflattering, the open-arse fruit. Yet for all its unappealing looks, the medlar was both beloved and culturally significant in the Middle Ages. The defining trait of the medlar was that it could not be eaten straight from the tree. Pick one too early and it was hard, sour, and inedible. Instead, it had to go through a process called bletting, a form of controlled rotting. Farmers would harvest the fruit in late autumn and then store it in straw, in dark cellars, or on wooden shelves until it softened and its flesh turned almost like a brown puree. Only then did the medlar transform into something edible, tasting like a mixture of spiced applesauce, dates, and wine. This waiting period made the medlar a fruit of patience and transformation. In a world where fresh fruits were often eaten seasonally, the medlar stood out as one of the few fruits available during winter months. Once bletted, it provided a burst of sweetness and energy at a time when diets were otherwise dominated by salted meats, dried beans, and stale bread. For peasants, the medlar was more than a curiosity, it was a seasonal lifeline. But the medlar was never just about taste. In medieval symbolism, it became a metaphor for human morality, time, and even sexuality. Writers compared the fruit's unattractive outer shell and delayed edibility to the idea that wisdom and virtue often came only after life's hardships. Nothing good without waiting, the meddler seemed to whisper. Yet at the same time, its vulgar nickname meant it was also linked to lust and indecency in bawdy jokes, tavern songs, and plays. The fruit even appeared in Shakespeare's works centuries later, often as a symbol of lewdness and decay. But long before Elizabethan dramatists made such references, medieval poets and moralists had already found in the medlar a rich source of metaphor. Its unusual life cycle, the need to rot before ripening, fascinated minds trained to find allegory in every corner of nature. In practice, though, what mattered most was how it tasted and what it could provide. Medieval cooks turned medlars into preserves, pastes, and wines. A common delicacy was medlar cheese, which was not dairy-based, but rather a thick, sweet paste made of bletted medlars, cooked down with honey or sugar, then allowed to set into a sliceable block. This was served at feasts alongside wafers or bread, much like quince paste in Spain. It was a way of transforming an unassuming fruit into a dessert of surprising refinement. While peasants enjoyed medlars as a winter treat, the fruit also found a place at the tables of the wealthy. Lords and merchants liked to display medlars at banquets, not because they looked elegant, quite the opposite, but because they carried connotations of rarity and cleverness. To serve medlars was to show that you had the patient's knowledge and means to prepare them properly. In this sense, the fruit became a subtle marker of cultural sophistication. Medlars were also prized by apothecaries. Medical texts of the Middle Ages praised them for treating digestive troubles, liver ailments, and sore throats. Because bletted medlars were soft and soothing, they were often prescribed for the sick, the elderly, and children. The fruit's gentle laxative effect made it useful in an era when constipation and stomach troubles were common. Its seeds and leaves were also boiled into decoctions believed to cool the body's heat, according to Galenic medicine. Interestingly, the medlar's delayed ripening meant that it was one of the few fresh fruits that could appear on a Christmas table. While apples and pears might be long gone or shriveled, medlars were at their peak during December. Thus, they became associated with midwinter feasting, bridging the gap between autumn's harvest and spring's renewal. Imagine the contrast. While snow fell outside, a bowl of soft, sweet medlars might bring a taste of Earth's generosity indoors. The fruit's odd shape and its scandalous nickname also ensured its place in popular humor. Medieval jesters and writers relished the opportunity to mock its resemblance to human anatomy. In bawdy tales, the medlar represented aging and lust, since it was at once a fruit of decay and desire. This double symbolism meant that it could appear in both sermons, warning of sin's corruption, and taverns where its form provoked laughter. But what makes the medlar truly fascinating is how it embodied medieval attitudes toward time. Many fruits ripened quickly and spoiled just as fast, but the medlar demanded patience, rewarding those who understood its rhythm. In this way, it mirrored the agricultural year itself, long months of labor followed by short bursts of reward. Farmers saw in the medlar a living metaphor for endurance the belief that the best things often required waiting, even suffering. Medieval households even developed rituals around the fruit. After harvest, families would carefully lay medlars out in straw-lined baskets, checking them over weeks until the flesh softened. Children were sometimes sent to inspect the fruit daily, turning it into a kind of seasonal countdown. When at last the medlars were ready, they might be eaten plain, mashed into porridges or mixed with ale to create a warming winter drink. These small traditions gave the fruit a role not only in diet, but in the rhythm of family life. In monasteries, medlars were cultivated in cloister gardens alongside quince and apples. Monks valued them for both their practical and symbolic qualities. A medlar tree bearing its strange fruits was a natural sermon about humility, patience, and hidden worth. Some manuscripts even illustrated medlars in the margins, showing their distinctive star-shaped crowns as visual reminders of lessons about virtue concealed beneath rough exteriors. By the later Middle Ages, the medlar had firmly entrenched itself as a cultural icon. It appeared in literature, in medicine, in feasts, and in everyday diets. Yet its very strangeness would later contribute to its decline. As Renaissance tastes shifted toward fruits that were both beautiful and convenient, apples polished to a shine, pears with delicate flavors, cherries that could be eaten straight from the tree, the medlar seemed coarse and troublesome by comparison. Still, during the centuries when it flourished, it played a unique role in binding together the seasons, the classes, and the spiritual imagination of Europe. For peasants, it was food security in the lean months. For nobles, it was an intellectual and culinary curiosity. For monks, it was a meditation on the value of patience. Few fruits could claim such a wide spectrum of meanings. One of the most intriguing aspects of the medlar was how it blurred the line between decay and nourishment. To modern eyes, eating a fruit that has deliberately rotted seems unthinkable. But medieval people lived with a more fluid relationship to food and spoilage. Fermentation was everywhere. Beer, wine, cheese, and pickled vegetables all relied on transformation by time. The medlar fit naturally into this worldview. It was not rotten in the sense of dangerous, but rather transfigured by waiting. This acceptance of controlled decay reveals a lot about medieval survival strategies. In a world without refrigeration, people learned to trust time as an ally rather than an enemy. They recognized that nature's processes could make things better, not worse. The medlar was a teacher in this regard, reminding them that patience, even in the face of apparent ruin, could yield sweetness. Unfortunately, by the 17th and 18th centuries, medlars had begun to vanish from gardens and markets. Their awkward appearance, short shelf life, and suggestive nickname made them less desirable in an era increasingly obsessed with refinement and elegance. Today, they linger only in rare orchards and in the pages of old manuscripts. To most people, the medlar is a forgotten fruit, its memory preserved only in folklore and literature. And yet, if you ever taste a medlar today, soft, sweet, with notes of wine and spice, you can experience something medieval people knew well, the mystery of time ripening, what at first seems worthless. Perhaps that is why the fruit, despite its decline, still fascinates historians and food enthusiasts alike. It reminds us that the past had its own logic of flavor, one in which patience and transformation were central. To bring back the Medlar would not just be to revive a forgotten fruit. It would be to reconnect with a worldview that embraced slowness, seasonality, and symbolism. In an age of instant gratification, the Meddler's lesson feels oddly modern. Sometimes the sweetest things are the ones worth waiting for. If you had lived in a medieval village surrounded by forests, chances are you would have stumbled upon the service berry tree, also known as amelanchier. This unassuming shrub or small tree produced clusters of small purplish berries that looked a little like blueberries but carried a taste that was their own sweet, nutty and slightly almond-like. Unlike apples or pears that demanded careful cultivation, service berries grew wild along hedgerows, in woodland clearings and at the edges of fields. In many ways, they were the perfect medieval snack, abundant, easy to harvest, and requiring no tools to enjoy. What made service berries especially valuable was their timing. They ripened early in summer, often before other fruits were ready. This made them a seasonal lifeline. After a long winter of dried peas, grains, and salted meat, villagers craved fresh, juicy foods that could replenish their bodies. Service berries offered that first burst of sweetness, signaling that the hungry months of scarcity were drawing to an end. In some places, the berries were so closely tied to the rhythm of the seasons that their flowering marked the start of spring festivals. Their name itself reveals their role in medieval life. Serviceberry may have derived from the Old English sorbus, a related tree, or as some folklorists suggest, from their use during funeral services. The berries often ripened at the same time the ground thawed enough for burials, so they became linked to rites of passage. In Northern Europe, serviceberry blossoms were sometimes placed on graves, blending the cycles of food and mortality into a single symbol. Yet beyond symbolism, medieval people knew the berry as food. Families collected them in baskets and ate them fresh by the handful. They also learned to preserve them by drying. Dried service berries shrank into chewy, raisin-like morsels that could last for months. This preservation technique turned them into a portable energy source for hunters, shepherds, and even soldiers. In fact, in later centuries, North American indigenous peoples would famously combine dried service berries with fat and meat to make pemmican a survival food, so nourishing it kept explorers alive for months. Though medieval Europeans didn't use the same recipe, they too recognized that the berry's durability made it a perfect companion in uncertain times. But service berries were not just practical. They were also seen as a kind of woodland treasure. Children were often sent to gather them, turning the harvest into a game. Birds and animals loved them too, meaning that villagers had to act quickly if they wanted to secure their share. The berries' abundance in wild spaces made them a democratic fruit, unlike orchard apples, which were controlled by lords or monasteries' service. Berries could be picked by anyone who found them. For peasants, this gave the fruit a liberating quality. It was food unclaimed by the rigid systems of land ownership. In medieval herbals, the service berry rarely appears as prominently as plums or cherries. Yet it was recognized for its healing qualities. The berries were thought to ease stomach troubles, quench thirst and cool the blood in hot seasons. Leaves and bark were also brewed into teas for fevers. These folk uses, though not always written into elite texts, were passed down orally through generations of rural families who relied on local plants for survival. As much as service berries fed the body, they also fed the imagination of medieval people. Their delicate white blossoms, appearing in early spring, were seen as symbols of purity and renewal. In some regions, villagers associated the flowers with marriage rituals, weaving them into garlands or placing them on altars. The timing of their bloom just before wheat planting also made them a natural marker in the agricultural calendar. They were in effect the trees that kept time for farmers. Interestingly, service berries bridged the gap between wild foraging and early cultivation. While they mostly grew untended, some households encouraged them near garden edges, much as they did with elderberries or sloes. They were not grafted or pruned like orchard fruits, but they were tolerated and even protected because people recognized their worth. For poorer families, this blurred the line between wild and domestic. A hedge full of service berries was as valuable as any lord's apple orchard. The fruit also carried social meaning. Because it was available to anyone willing to pick service berries, became woven into the communal fabric of peasant diets. A neighbor might share a pouch of dried berries during a winter gathering, or a shepherd might offer them to companions on a long watch. Unlike luxury imports such as figs or dates, which only the wealthy could afford, service berries symbolized common resilience, the kind of food that kept entire villages alive without ever appearing in royal feasts. Still, service berries did find their way into more refined settings, though often disguised. Medieval cooks, especially in monasteries, experimented with turning them into jellies and syrups. Their natural sweetness and faint almond flavor made them ideal for thickening into sauces for fish or mixing into mead. These recipes were not widespread, but show that the berry's versatility was recognized beyond the peasant household. In many ways, service berries were a hidden ingredient present, but rarely named, humble yet essential. Another layer of significance came from the berry's association with wild animals and birds. Medieval bestiaries often emphasized how birds and beasts knew instinctively which fruits to eat, and the service berry became an example of God's provision for all creatures. Observing thrushes, starlings, or bears feeding on the fruit reinforced the belief that nature's gifts were distributed fairly. This reinforced a worldview in which humans were simply part of a larger cycle of consumption and renewal. By the late Middle Ages, however, service berries began to lose ground to more intensively cultivated fruits. The spread of orchards meant that apples, pears, and cherries dominated markets, while service berries remained associated with wild foraging. This shift carried a social weight. To eat service berries was to remain tied to the woods and hedgerows, symbols of poverty or marginal life. For wealthier households, the fruit was nearly invisible. But for peasants, it remained an anchor, proof that the land could still provide even when fields failed. The fact that they never became a prestige fruit is part of why they eventually faded from European diets. Unlike mulberries, which tied into silk, or damsons, which became valuable in preserves service, berries lacked a commercial hook. Yet their very ordinariness was their strength. They were food for the many, not the few. Looking back, it is striking how service berries embody the forgotten resilience of medieval food systems. They weren't glamorous, but they were dependable. They fed hungry children in June, strengthened workers during long harvest days, and provided medicine when healers had little else. Their disappearance from mainstream diets is less about their lack of value and more about the rise of centralized agriculture, which favored fruits that could be easily stored, traded, and taxed. Service berries simply didn't fit that model. Today, however, their story invites us to reconsider what we've lost. Modern nutritionists now point out that service berries are incredibly rich in antioxidants, fiber, and vitamins, often surpassing blueberries. Their nutty undertones come from compounds related to almond flavoring, and their high sugar content makes them ideal for jams and wines. In other words, they're a superfruit hidden in plain sight, ignored simply because history left them behind. Reviving service berries today could serve multiple purposes. For one, they thrive in temperate climates without demanding heavy care, making them excellent for sustainable farming. They could also reintroduce biodiversity into food systems that have become dangerously narrow. Just as medieval peasants once relied on them when harvests failed, we too could use them as insurance crops in a time of climate instability. Their resilience against poor soils and unpredictable weather is exactly the trait that once made them beloved. There is also a cultural value to their revival. Imagine rediscovering the flavor that medieval villagers once tasted after a long winter, the first wild sweetness of summer. Bringing service berries back isn't just about nutrition. It's about reconnecting with a past where food was intimately tied to the land and its rhythms. They remind us that not all important foods were cultivated in neat rows or traded in bustling markets. Some simply grew where they wished, offering themselves freely to those who knew where to look. For medieval people, service berries were more than just fruit. They were a seasonal signal, a medicine chest, a peasant's luxury, and a communal gift. They nourished bodies and anchored traditions, even if they never appeared on the tables of kings. Their fading from memory is a loss not only of taste, but of a world view that valued what the wild could provide. If mulberries represented ambition and silk, and damsons symbolized trade and preservation, service berries stood for something quieter, but equally vital, the survival of the many. They may not have shaped economies or inspired poetry, but they kept hunger at bay for countless nameless villagers. And perhaps that is the truest kind of historical importance. Among the hedgerows and tangled field edges of medieval Europe grew a fruit that few today would recognize by name, the damson plum. Smaller, darker, and more tart than the common plum, the damson was a staple of the countryside, thriving where other fruits failed. Its name is thought to trace back to Damascus, hinting at ancient origins carried into Europe through trade routes that linked east and west. By the Middle Ages, however, the damson had taken root firmly in England, France, and beyond, where it became a fruit of the hedgerow, half wild, half domesticated, always present in the rural imagination. For medieval farmers, the damson was a fruit of survival and adaptability. Unlike delicate apples or pears that needed careful tending, damsons could flourish in less fertile soils and withstand harsher conditions. Their resilience meant they were planted in borders, near cottages and alongside roads. In some cases, they even grew wild, their dark purple skins blending with the brambles and hawthorn. This hardiness made them accessible to everyone, from peasant families to monastic communities, ensuring that damsons were rarely absent from the medieval diet. When eaten fresh, damsons were sharp and tangy, not the sweet bite most modern palates associate with plums. But medieval people were not put off by tartness. Indeed, they prized it. Damsons could be cooked down into stews, baked into pies, or boiled into thick preserves that lasted long after the fruit itself had passed. Their high pectin content made them especially suited for jams and jellies, which were valued not just for taste but for medicine. Physicians believed that damson preserves cooled fevers, calmed the stomach, and balanced humours in times of illness. Beyond the kitchen, damsons had a role in the crafts and trades of the medieval world. Their deep purple skins were a source of natural dye, producing shades ranging from violet to black. In an age when clothing colour conveyed rank and meaning, this was no small contribution. Textiles coloured with damson dye might not rival the richness of imported indigo, but they offered an affordable alternative for local households. But perhaps the most enduring memory of damsons lies in the drinks they inspired. Medieval households often brewed damson wine or cordial, a potent and warming beverage that brought colour to long winters. Though such drinks lacked the refinement of imported wines, they carried a flavour rooted in the land itself, a reminder that even the hedgerows could yield luxuries. Shared at harvest festivals, religious feasts, or quiet family gatherings, damson drinks carried with them a sense of belonging and seasonality. The damson's importance stretched far beyond the dining table. In times of scarcity, particularly during the Great Famine, 1315 to 1317, damsons became a crucial food reserve. Families who had carefully preserved their damson jams or dried fruits found themselves with an unexpected lifeline when grain supplies dwindled and livestock perished. Unlike imported goods, which could vanish when trade collapsed, damsons were reliable because they grew just outside the village. Their role in medicine was equally significant. Damsons were considered a gentle laxative, helping to cleanse the body of excess humours. Apothecaries often dried them and mixed them with honey to produce syrups prescribed for constipation or sluggish digestion. Some texts even describe damsons as protective against scurvy, centuries before the disease was fully understood. Their tartness hinted at their richness in nutrients, what we now know as vitamin C, making them a subtle but real safeguard against deficiency in an otherwise limited diet. Culturally, damsons carried symbolism tied to their bittersweet taste. They were fruits of duality, sweetness hidden within tartness, abundance hidden within simplicity. In medieval poetry, they were sometimes used as metaphors for love, dark on the outside, rich within, but leaving a sharpness behind. Folk traditions occasionally linked them to protection against misfortune. Branches of damson trees were woven into charms or planted near boundaries to ward off ill luck, blending practical hedgerow management with superstition. Monasteries, always attentive to both agriculture and medicine, cultivated damsons with care. Records from monastic gardens show damsons listed alongside apples, pears, and medlars, confirming their valued place in structured agriculture. Monks transformed them into medicinal syrups stored in apothecary jars, used both for the community and for travelers seeking remedies. The fact that these preserves often lasted for months was particularly important for monastic infirmaries, which had to treat patients year-round. One often overlooked use of damsons was in ink making. Combined with iron salts, damson juice could produce a dark pigment suitable for writing. While oak galls remained the dominant source of ink, the damson offered a supplementary or emergency solution. This link between fruit and script is a reminder that the produce of the hedgerows helped sustain not just physical survival, but the preservation of knowledge itself. By the later Middle Ages, damsons had woven themselves into the rhythms of seasonal life. They were harvested in late summer, preserved through autumn, and consumed during the cold months. The simple act of boiling damsons into thick, jewel-colored paste carried echoes of ritual families working together, stirring heavy pots, sealing earthenware jars, and storing them carefully for the leaner times ahead. Despite their wide presence, damsons slowly began to lose prominence in the centuries that followed. The Renaissance brought with it new fruits from abroad, citrus apricots, peaches that dazzled the wealthy and reshaped agricultural priorities. Orchards once devoted to damsons gave way to more profitable varieties, and the damson slipped into the background of rural life. By the early modern period, damsons survived mainly as hedgerow fruits overlooked, except by those who remembered their uses. Yet the damson's influence lingered. In England, particularly, it became associated with regions like Shropshire and Westmoreland, where its cultivation persisted well into modern times. Local traditions linked damsons with the production of dyes for wool, giving rise to fabrics of deep blue-black hues prized in northern markets. This practical legacy connects the damson not just to food, but to the very cloth people wore. Today, damsons remain an underappreciated fruit, but they deserve recognition as part of the survival toolkit of the medieval farmer. Unlike fragile delicacies, damsons embodied durability. They could withstand poor weather, they preserved well, and they nourished both body and spirit. Their tartness was not a flaw, but a feature, an invitation to transform them into something greater through human ingenuity. Reintroducing damsons into the modern world could carry benefits beyond nostalgia. Their high antioxidant levels, strong flavor, and suitability for preserves align perfectly with today's renewed interest in traditional foods and natural health. Small orchards and specialty growers have begun reviving damsons, marketing them as heritage fruits. In a sense, they are returning to their rightful place, not as forgotten scraps of history, but as living testaments to the endurance of medieval knowledge. The story of the damson is ultimately a story of resilience and resourcefulness. In an era when survival depended on making the most of what nature offered, damsons filled an important niche. They provided medicine, nourishment, dye, and even ink, proving that even the humblest fruits of the hedgerow could support a civilization. Their bittersweet taste encapsulated the medieval condition itself. Hardship softened by fleeting sweetness, austerity colored by richness. To bite into a damson today is to taste the same sharp fruit that countless medieval villagers once plucked from their hedges. It is to connect with a world where nothing was wasted, where every berry carried value, and where survival often hinged on the fruits most easily overlooked. Among the many fruits of the medieval world, few were as peculiar or as controversial as the medlar. With its gnarled brown shape, open calyx, resembling a puckered mouth and curious ripening process, the medlar stood apart from the polished beauty of apples or pears. To many, it looked unappetizing, even grotesque. But in medieval Europe, appearances were not the whole story. Beneath its odd exterior, the medlar offered nourishment symbolism and a taste that could only be unlocked after an unusual transformation. It had to rot before it was edible. The medlar Misspylus germanica was native to Southwest Asia and Southeastern Europe, but it had been cultivated since Roman times. Romans appreciated its hardiness, planting orchards across their empire. By the medieval period, the medlar had become firmly embedded in European food culture, especially in England, France, and Germany. Unlike figs or pomegranates, which carried exotic associations, the medlar was distinctly local, humble, rustic, and tied to the rhythms of temperate climates. What made the medlar truly strange was its ripening process. Picked fresh from the tree, the fruit was rock-hard and inedible. Only after weeks of storage, when the flesh softened and turned brown, did the medlar become edible. This process, known as bletting, was essentially controlled rotting. As the fruit broke down, its flavor transformed into something unique, sweet-spiced and reminiscent of dates or apple butter. To medieval palates accustomed to sourness and bitterness, the medlar's mellow richness after bletting was a prized surprise. This quality made the medlar a fruit of patience and delayed reward. Households gathered them in late autumn, storing them carefully in straw or sawdust until winter. In December or January, when fresh fruits were scarce, medlars reached their peak, offering a taste of abundance in the leanest months. For peasants, they were a small luxury. For the wealthy, they were curiosities displayed at feasts, their strange form sparking conversation. Medlars also carried symbolic weight. Their grotesque appearance and need for decay before sweetness lent them to metaphors about morality, love, and mortality. Poets compared them to old age, to women past their prime, or to the hidden sweetness that comes only through time and hardship. The English writer Geoffrey Chaucer and later William Shakespeare both alluded to medlars as bawdy symbols, using their suggestive shape and rotting quality to humorous or cynical effect. In this sense, the medlar lived a double life, both humble fruit and object of literary imagination. In the practical world of the medieval kitchen, medlars were versatile. Once bletted, they could be eaten raw, scooped with a spoon like jam, or cooked into preserves and pastes. Their thick texture made them ideal for spiced compotes served at noble tables, while poorer households enjoyed them simply with bread. They were sometimes mixed with wine or ale to create warming drinks. Apothecaries, too, found use for medlars. They were said to settle the stomach-aid digestion and counter excess choler. Thus, the medlar straddled the line between the grotesque and the cherished, the ridiculous and the nourishing. In an age when every plant had a role to play, the medlar proved that even the strangest fruits could earn a valued place in both diet and culture. The cultural symbolism of the medlar ran deep in medieval society. Because it only became edible after decay, it became a metaphor for life, death, and transformation. Clerics used it in sermons to illustrate the Christian idea that suffering or corruption could lead to redemption. In literature, it symbolized hidden virtues or the irony of beauty found in unexpected places. Yet its bawdy nicknames, such as open arse, a crude English term for its shape, reveal that common folk often saw it through a more earthy lens. This duality reflected medieval humor. Earthy realism coexisted with profound spirituality. For peasants, the medlar's strangeness was simply accepted. It was food that arrived when other fruits failed. For poets and moralists, however, it was an allegory, a reminder that appearances deceive and that sweetness often comes from unlikely sources. Medlars were also tied to seasonal rituals. Because they ripened in winter, they were sometimes eaten during Yuletide celebrations, symbolizing endurance and the promise of renewal. In some regions, medlars were associated with fertility charms or protective rites, perhaps due to their unusual form. Just as apples and nuts featured in fortune-telling games, medlars carried meanings beyond nutrition. From a practical standpoint, medlars were valuable because they extended the fruit season. Most medieval fruits spoiled quickly or required drying. Medlars, however, could be stored whole until midwinter, providing fresh texture long after the harvest had ended. In this sense, they complemented the medieval strategy of survival, spreading food resources across seasons to avoid famine. Their importance was not as dramatic as grain or salted meat, but in times of hunger, every fruit mattered. In the kitchen, cooks found creative ways to integrate medlars. Medlar cheese, a thick fruit paste, similar to quince paste, was a popular preserve among the wealthy. Its spiced, concentrated flavor paired well with meats and cheeses at banquets. Recipes from later medieval sources suggest medlar tarts spiced with cinnamon, ginger, and cloves, indicating their presence on elite tables alongside more fashionable fruits. Apothecaries and physicians valued medlars for their digestive properties. They were considered binding, useful against diarrhea, and capable of calming unsettled stomachs. Dried medlars could be ground into powders mixed with wine or honey for medicinal drinks. The fruit's ability to ripen in storage also meant it could be drawn upon for treatments throughout the winter, long after other fruits were gone. Economically, medlars never reached the prominence of apples or pears, but they filled an important niche. Their hardiness made them reliable, and their novelty ensured a place in markets and fairs. While city dwellers might have laughed at their oddity, country folk knew their value. In many hedgerows, medlar trees stood alongside damsons and sloes, forming part of the living larder that supported rural life. Thus, the medlar was never a glamorous fruit, but it was a deeply medieval one, strange, useful, symbolic, and enduring. Its combination of practicality and metaphor ensured that it left a mark on the cultural as well as the culinary landscape. By the late Middle Ages, the medlar's reputation was already shifting. As trade expanded and new fruits entered Europe, the medlar began to seem old-fashioned. Oranges, lemons, and apricots dazzled the wealthy with their bright colors and exotic origins, while the humble medlar looked increasingly rustic. Yet it lingered in rural areas where tradition outweighed fashion. Farmers still gathered them each autumn, storing them in straw and eating them during the bleak winter months. Writers of the Renaissance often mocked the medlar, using it as a symbol of decay or uselessness. Shakespeare, for example, made coarse jokes about medlars in Romeo and Juliet and Timon of Athens. Yet even in mockery, the medlar held cultural weight. It was a fruit everyone recognized, even if only to laugh at. Over time, however, its decline accelerated. Orchard space was devoted to more profitable fruits, and the medlar became relegated to hedgerows and odd corners of gardens. By the modern era, it was nearly forgotten, remembered only by antiquarians and regional traditions in parts of England and France. Today, it survives as a heritage fruit, valued by enthusiasts who celebrate its unique flavor and history. Looking back, the medlar encapsulates the ingenuity and adaptability of medieval life. It was a fruit that seemed worthless until transformed a metaphor not just for patience, but for the way medieval people made use of everything available to them. Nothing was dismissed outright. If it could be eaten preserved or turned into medicine, it found a place. The medlar also speaks to the symbolic imagination of the medieval world. Where we might see only an odd-looking fruit, medieval people saw meaning, moral lessons, humorous comparisons, reflections on the passage of time. Their ability to draw connections between the natural and the spiritual, the everyday and the eternal, gave the medlar a cultural depth that modern fruits rarely achieve. In an age when survival depended on variety and resourcefulness, the medlar was part of the unseen backbone of the diet. It was not glamorous, but it was reliable, nourishing, and thought-provoking. Its very strangeness made it memorable, ensuring its place in both kitchens and literature. Today, to taste a medlar soft spiced, almost like toffee, or mulled wine is to share an experience with countless medieval villagers, monks and nobles. It is to taste not just a fruit, but a fragment of a world view in which even decay could be turned into sweetness. Among the many fruits that shaped medieval diets and imaginations, few were as deeply wrapped in mystery, superstition, and practical medicine as the elderberry. The elder tree, Sambucus nigra, stood at the intersection of fear and reverence. Its clusters of dark purple berries were small, tart, and a little bitter. Yet in the medieval world, they held outsized importance, sometimes forbidden, sometimes blessed, always powerful. Elder trees carried a reputation unlike that of any orchard fruit. To plant one near your home was both a blessing and a danger. Folklore warned that spirits, witches, or even the devil himself could inhabit the hollow branches. Cutting down an elder without permission was considered an invitation to misfortune. People whispered that witches crafted their wands and charms from elder wood, which might explain why it was both feared and respected. Some households recited protective prayers before gathering berries, asking the tree's spirit for permission. Despite the fear, medieval farmers did not ignore the elderberry. They knew its practical value. The fruit ripened in late summer, providing food when other supplies ran low. Though bitter when raw, the berries could be cooked into wines, cordial syrups and pies. Elderberry wine in particular became a favorite among peasants who could not afford the grapes reserved for monasteries and lords. Its deep, rich color gave it a ceremonial feel, and it was often used at feasts, festivals, and even modest weddings. Yet elderberries were valued less for taste and more for their medicinal properties. Monastic physicians and herbalists recorded them as cures for fevers, chest ailments, and digestive troubles. The Leech Book of Bald, a famous Anglo-Saxon medical text, mentions elder for treating coughs and congestion. By the medieval period, elderberry syrup was one of the most common remedies for winter colds, seen as a way to drive out evil humors from the body. Elderflowers, too, were dried and brewed into teas that soothed fevers and calmed nerves. This dual nature, both feared and cherished, gave elderberries a unique role in community life. A family might plant an elder tree by the edge of their garden, not in the orchard, but in a liminal space between the wild and the domestic. There it could serve as both a protective guardian and a source of healing. The smell of its blossoms in spring was said to keep away insects and even evil spirits, while its berries in autumn promised relief during the sickness-heavy winter months. For medieval villagers, elderberries symbolized the fine balance between danger and salvation. Mishandle the tree and you might invite a curse. Respect it, and it could provide remedies that meant the difference between survival and loss. This was no simple fruit. It was a mediator between the natural and supernatural worlds. As the elderberry's reputation grew, it entered not only the household, but also the marketplace and the monastery. By the 12th century, elderberry wines and syrups were traded at fairs, particularly in northern Europe, where grapes were scarce. A jug of elderberry cordial might be found alongside mead ale and cider, offering a cheaper yet satisfying option for celebrations. Monasteries with their vast gardens of medicinal plants made extensive use of elder. Benedictine monks in particular cultivated elder groves, recording recipes for tonics in Latin manuscripts. These included mixtures of elderberries with honey vinegar and herbs such as thyme and mint. They were prescribed for fevers, chest infections, and even plague prevention. During outbreaks, elderberry-based remedies were consumed as a form of protection, not always effective, but deeply believed in. The fruit's strong pigmentation also gave an aura of potency. If a remedy was dark and staining, surely it carried strength. But elderberries were not without controversy. Their connection to witchcraft continued to haunt them. Folk tales told of witches shape-shifting into elder trees or using the berries in curses. In some regions, villagers refused to burn elder wood in their hearths, fearing it would summon misfortune. Children were often forbidden from climbing elder trees or eating the raw berries, not only because of mild toxicity, but also because of their spiritual reputation. Ironically, these superstitions may have protected people from harm. Unripe or uncooked elderberries can cause nausea and sickness due to cyanogenic glycosides. By discouraging majal consumption, folklore may have saved many a peasant from a miserable stomachache. Only those who respected the elder enough to cook it properly could safely benefit from its gifts. The elder tree also appeared in Christian symbolism, though in a darker role. Legends claimed that Judas Iscariot hanged himself from an elder tree, forever cursing it with an association to betrayal and death. Whether true or not, the tail-shaped attitudes toward the plant making it simultaneously feared and revered. Some priests, however, flipped this symbolism, arguing that just as Christ redeemed humanity, so too could the humble elder redeem health when used wisely. Elderberry remedies also reflected the broader humoral theory of medicine. Medieval physicians believed the body's health depended on the balance of four humors: blood phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. Elderberry syrups were classified as cooling medicines, used to counter fevers and hot ailments. A patient with inflamed lungs or a raging fever might be prescribed elderberry drinks to restore equilibrium. Even if the medical logic was flawed, the antioxidant and antiviral properties of elderberries, known to modern science, meant that these treatments may have provided real relief. Thus, elderberries stood at a crossroads: a folk remedy, a monastic medicine, a feared witch's fruit, and a poor man's wine. No other medieval fruit carried quite the same paradox. Toward the end of the medieval era, elderberries had secured their place as a household essential. Even if feared in legend, they were too useful to ignore. Recipes for elderberry syrups, wines, and ointments spread widely, and nearly every village healer knew how to prepare them. In some areas, children drank diluted elderberry cordial as a tonic during the winter, while adults enjoyed stronger wines at seasonal feasts. Beyond medicine and drink, elderberries influenced material culture. The juice was sometimes used as an inexpensive dye staining cloths and parchment. Though it faded over time, it provided a substitute for costly purple dyes made from rare plants or sea snails. Poorer families who wanted a touch of color in their clothing might settle for elderberries' deep hues. Elderwood also had its place. Farmers fashioned small tools, pipes, and even crossbow bolts from its lightweight branches. Hollow elder stems made natural flutes, giving the plant a role in folk music. Children might carve whistles from elder twigs during summer festivals, creating sounds that were both playful and eerie. These cultural uses added to the elder's mystical reputation. Music made from elder carried whispers of both joy and danger. Yet despite its everyday role, the elder never fully escaped its shadowy symbolism. Even in the late Middle Ages, villagers hesitated to cut one down without ritual permission. Some left offerings of bread or milk beneath the tree to appease its spirit before taking branches or berries. This practice blurred the line between Christianity and older pagan traditions, reflecting the persistence of folk religion within daily life. Why then did elderberries fade from prominence in later centuries? Part of the answer lies in the rise of imported fruits and refined medicine. As trade routes expanded, people gained access to citrus fruits, exotic spices, and new pharmacological knowledge. Elderberries, with their bitter taste and staining juice, seemed rustic by comparison. Apothecaries still used them, but wealthier households preferred more fashionable remedies. Over time, elderberries slipped into obscurity, preserved only in local traditions and folk recipes. Today, elderberries are making a quiet comeback. Modern science confirms many of the benefits. Medieval people intuited elderberries contain antioxidants and compounds that can reduce the severity of colds and flu. Herbal syrups, teas, and supplements are once again marketed as natural remedies for immunity. The same berries once dismissed as peasant fare now appear on health store shelves worldwide. The medieval world reminds us that elderberries were never just about taste. They were about survival belief and respect for the thin line between blessing and curse. To a peasant family huddled in a smoky hut during winter, a jar of elderberry syrup was more than a drink. It was a lifeline. To a monk in his cloister, an elder tree was a gift from God, even if feared by villagers outside. To a storyteller by the fire, the elder was a tree of ghosts, betrayal, and transformation. And perhaps that is why elderberries deserve a revival. They are not just forgotten fruit, but keepers of medieval memory of the fears, hopes, and remedies that shaped everyday life. In rediscovering them, we reconnect with a world where survival depended not only on what the land could provide, but on the courage to use it wisely. Among the forgotten fruits of the medieval world, few carried as much prestige, symbolism, and culinary importance as the quince. With its golden yellow skin, fragrant aroma, and peculiar mix of sweetness and tartness. The quince was a fruit that demanded patience but rewarded those who understood it. Unlike apples or pears, which could be eaten straight from the branch, quinces were rarely consumed raw. Instead, they needed to be cooked, transformed by fire into something extraordinary. Medieval farmers considered quinces a treasure of autumn, and monasteries across Europe cultivated orchards specifically for them. The fruit grew best in warmer climates, such as Spain, southern France, and Italy, but it was hardy enough to appear in English and German gardens as well. In fact, medieval texts often list the quince alongside apples and pears as one of the noble orchard fruits, reflecting its elevated status. One of the reasons quinces were so prized is their culinary versatility. When stewed with honey or sugar, they released a perfume-like aroma that filled kitchens with warmth. Cooks used quinces in pies, compotes, and even savory dishes paired with meats. The fruit's high pectin content meant it could easily be turned into preserves and pastes, the most famous of which survives today as the Spanish membrillo, a firm quince jelly traditionally eaten with cheese. This practice dates back to the Middle Ages, when quince pastes were among the few reliable ways to preserve fruit through the winter months. Beyond flavor, quinces were treasured for their medicinal properties. Physicians of the medieval period frequently recommended them to soothe stomach ailments, reduce fevers, and even freshen breath. Apothecaries distilled quince seeds into a mucilage, used for treating sore throats and inflamed skin. In medical manuscripts influenced by Galen and later Arabic scholars such as Avicenna the quince, was praised as a cooling, balancing fruit that could restore harmony to the body's humors. The quince also carried deep symbolic weight. Because of its golden glow and intoxicating fragrance, it was often associated with love, fertility, and prosperity. Some scholars believe that the golden apple of classical mythology, the fruit Paris awarded to Aphrodite, was actually a quince. This interpretation passed into medieval lore, where the fruit appeared in courtly love poetry and even in Christian allegories as a symbol of divine gifts. Couples sometimes shared a quince at weddings as a gesture of fidelity and sweetness in marriage. To medieval farmers, the quince was not just another orchard tree, but a marker of wealth and refinement. Owning quince orchards suggested that a landholder had both the knowledge and resources to cultivate specialty fruits. While peasants may have eaten wild quinces occasionally, it was the nobility and monasteries who most fully integrated them into cuisine, medicine, and culture. If the quince was a fruit of refinement, it was also a fruit of transformation. Few medieval foods better captured the ability of cooking to elevate nature into art. Raw quinces were rock-hard, sour, and often unpleasant. But once simmered slowly in wine, honey, or sugar, they softened into tender slices with a rich, rosy hue. In fact, one of the most delightful surprises for medieval diners was that quinces changed color when cooked, turning from pale yellow to a delicate pink, or even deep crimson. This transformation gave the fruit an almost alchemical aura. In the minds of many medieval cooks, it was as if the quince contained hidden magic waiting to be unlocked. Cookbooks from the 14th and 15th centuries describe recipes where quinces were boiled with spices, such as cinnamon, cloves, and ginger, to create dishes both fragrant and medicinal. The marriage of fruit, spice, and sugar reflected the fusion of European and Middle Eastern traditions that shaped medieval cuisine. Quinces also became a staple of banquets and feasts. Their bright color and sweet perfume made them an ideal ingredient for showpiece desserts. Served as a paste jelly or glazed dish, quinces impressed guests with both flavor and visual beauty. In noble courts, a tray of quince preserves was more than food. It was a statement of wealth, since sugar remained a rare luxury for most of the medieval period. To serve quince sweetmeats was to demonstrate one's access to exotic trade networks, linking Europe to the Mediterranean and beyond. At the same time, quinces played an important role in everyday survival. Because they could be preserved as pastes or dried slices, they provided reliable nourishment during the winter months when fresh fruit was scarce. Monasteries stocked their cellars with quince preserves alongside dried figs, nuts, and salted meats. For travelers, a block of quince paste was both portable and energizing, the medieval equivalent of a high-calorie ration bar. Religious associations deepened the quince's cultural significance. In Christian symbolism, the quince was sometimes linked to the Virgin Mary, representing purity and divine love. Illuminated manuscripts occasionally depicted the fruit in gardens of paradise, its golden sheen evoking heavenly light. The tree itself, with its fragrant blossoms and heavy fruit, became a metaphor for abundance bestowed by God. Yet the quince was not universally beloved. Some medieval writers complained about its difficulty to eat raw, warning that only those who knew how to prepare it properly could appreciate its virtues. In this sense, the quince came to represent refinement over ignorance, a fruit that rewarded skill but punished carelessness. This may help explain why it became such a favorite in elite circles. Like good wine or rare spices, it demanded knowledge and sophistication. By the late Middle Ages, quinces had firmly established themselves as both a culinary delight and a cultural emblem. Orchards dedicated to them flourished across Europe, and their presence in medieval cookbooks grew steadily. In fact, quinces may have been more widely used than lemons in Northern Europe before the citrus trade expanded in the Renaissance. Their tangy, aromatic flavor filled the same niche, balancing sweetness, enhancing savory dishes, and providing acidity where needed. The quince's preservation qualities also gave it a role in the history of early confectionery. Its high natural pectin content allowed medieval cooks to create firm jellies long before the advent of commercial gelatin. Quince paste was among the first fruit preserves that could be cut into slices, stored for months, and transported across distances. This innovation influenced later developments in candy-making, marmalades, and jams that became staples of European cuisine. Culturally, the quince never lost its associations with love and prosperity. In Mediterranean regions, gifting quinces at weddings remained a tradition well into the Renaissance. Some regions of Italy and Spain baked quinces into celebratory pastries during festivals. The fruit's fragrance was even used in perfumery. Bowls of quinces were left in chambers to sweeten the air, much like pomanders of citrus and cloves. But as Europe's trade networks expanded, the quince gradually lost its central place. The arrival of oranges, lemons, and later pineapples and bananas dazzled aristocratic tables with flavors more exotic and easier to consume raw. Quinces, with their toughness and preparation demands, slipped into relative obscurity outside traditional preserves like membrillo. By the 18th century, they were still present, but no longer the celebrated fruit of medieval feasts. Yet the legacy of the quince endures. Modern culinary historians recognize it as a bridge fruit, a link between the orchards of antiquity and the sweet confections of later Europe. Without quinces, the evolution of marmalades and fruit preserves might have taken a very different path. Without quince orchards, medieval monasteries and noble estates would have lacked one of their most versatile fruits. Today, quinces survive mostly in specialty orchards and in traditional Mediterranean cuisine. But if you've ever spread jelly on toast, eaten fruit paste with cheese, or marveled at the fragrance of cooked pears you are tasting, echoes of the medieval quince. Its golden skin, once a symbol of wealth and love, still glimmers faintly across centuries, inviting us to remember the fruit that once stood at the heart of Europe's orchards. In the story of medieval farming, the quince deserves its title as the golden gift. More than just food, it was a symbol, a medicine, a luxury, and a comfort, a reminder that some of history's most enduring treasures are not forgotten empires or famous battles, but the humble fruits that shaped daily life. Of all the curious fruits that graced medieval orchards, none provoked more fascination, amusement, and even ridicule than the Medlar Misspylus germanica. At first glance, it was a puzzling fruit, small, brown, and round, with a gaping star-shaped calyx at its bottom. Its appearance earned it many nicknames, some polite, others less so. In England, it was often called the open-arse fruit, a crude but descriptive reference to its shape. Shakespeare himself later played on this reputation in his comedies, using the medlar as a bawdy metaphor. But beyond the jokes, the medlar carried genuine cultural and culinary weight in the medieval world. Unlike apples or pears, medlars could not be eaten immediately after harvest. Instead, they had to undergo a process called bletting, a controlled over-ripening that softened the hard flesh into a sweet brown pulp. Only then did the medlar become edible, offering a flavor often compared to spiced apples, dates, or even wine. This strange necessity made the medlar a fruit of patience and paradox, worthless when fresh, precious after decay. In the medieval imagination, this transformation lent the medlar rich symbolic meaning. Preachers and poets seized on it as a metaphor for spiritual truths, that true virtue, wisdom, or sweetness might only come through time, hardship, or even suffering. The medlar's unattractive exterior contrasted with its hidden richness, echoing Christian teachings about humility and the rewards of perseverance. From a practical standpoint, medlars were relatively easy to cultivate. Hardy trees that thrived in poor soil, they were common in English, French, and German orchards by the high Middle Ages. Their fruit ripened late in the season, often just before winter, making them a useful addition to the medieval pantry. After bletting, medlars could be eaten as they were spread onto bread or mixed into sauces. Wealthier households incorporated them into tarts, custards, and spiced wines. Medicinally, the fruit was valued as a gentle laxative and a digestive aid. Herbalists recommended medlars for loosening the belly and for balancing the humors in cases of sluggish digestion. Their seeds and bark were sometimes ground into powders for treating kidney ailments. Despite the crude jokes about their appearance, apothecaries took the medlar seriously as part of the medieval pharmacopoeia. Culturally, the medlar also became associated with aging and mortality. Because it was edible only after softening and darkening, many writers likened it to human life, unappealing in youth, but sweet and wise in age. Others, more cynically, compared the medlar to decay and corruption, claiming it symbolized death disguised as sweetness. This double-edged symbolism ensured that the fruit remained a frequent subject in medieval poetry, sermons, and moral allegories. The medlar's reputation as a fruit of paradox became most apparent in literature and art. In English poetry, it was often used as a metaphor for flawed beauty or hidden worth. Chaucer mentioned medlars, as did later writers like Shakespeare and Thomas Nash, who wove them into witty, often ribald commentary on love and desire. The fruit's suggestive appearance gave it a place in bawdy humor, yet its delayed sweetness also lent itself to serious reflections on time, aging, and the nature of pleasure. In courtly culture, medlars occasionally appeared at banquets, though they never enjoyed the same prestige as quinces or pomegranates. Instead, they were considered a curious delicacy, something unusual to serve to guests, often with spiced wine or cream. For the gentry, part of the enjoyment was the novelty, the idea that this rough, ugly little fruit could hide unexpected sweetness. In this sense, serving medlars was not only culinary, but also intellectual, a way of demonstrating familiarity with the metaphors and symbolism surrounding them. The process of bletting was itself a subject of fascination. To blet a medlar, one stored it in straw or on shelves until the flesh softened and darkened. Medieval cooks compared this to the ripening of figs or dates, but the medlar's transformation was more dramatic. Some described it as a kind of fermentation, others as controlled decay. Either way, the result was a unique fruit that blurred the line between fresh produce and preserved food. Because of this, medlars also carried associations with winter and survival. They ripened after most other fruits had disappeared, offering a late harvest treat when supplies were running thin. For peasants, medlars could provide much-needed calories during the lean months. For monasteries, the fruit fit neatly into their cycles of fasting and feasting, offering a modest sweetness that aligned with ascetic values. In Christian allegory, the medlar's strange ripening process was sometimes used to illustrate the resurrection, that new life and sweetness can emerge from what appears rotten or dead. Conversely, moralists also warned against the medlar's deceptive appearance, claiming it was a fruit that embodied corruption hidden beneath a fair skin. This dual symbolism meant that the medlar could represent both salvation and sin, depending on the lesson the writer wished to impart. Despite these deep associations, the medlar never achieved the broad popularity of apples or pears. Part of the reason was its demanding nature. It required patience and knowledge to prepare, and not everyone enjoyed its flavor. For many peasants, the fruit was eaten simply because it was available, not because it was beloved. Among elites, its role was more symbolic than staple, a conversation piece, rather than a centerpiece of cuisine. By the late Middle Ages, the medlar had become firmly entrenched in European orchards, but its reputation remained ambiguous. Part fruit, part metaphor. It symbolized both wisdom and decay, both patience and corruption. For this reason, it lingered in the cultural imagination long after other orchard fruits surpassed it in popularity. Culinarily, the medlar paved the way for later traditions of fruit preservation. Its soft, jam-like consistency after bletting made it easy to mix with honey spices or wine, creating spreads and sauces that foreshadowed modern jams. In some regions, medlar cheese, a thick fruit paste similar to quince membrillo, was prepared for winter storage. Though not as famous, these preserves contributed to the medieval development of confectionery and fruit cookery. The fruit's cultural afterlife was even more significant. Renaissance writers continued to use the medlar as a symbol of love, lust, and mortality. Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet contains one of the most famous references when Mercutio makes a crude joke about medlars as a metaphor for female sexuality. Elsewhere, the fruit became a symbol for delayed gratification, reminding readers that sweetness often requires time and patience. Over time, however, the medlar began to fade from prominence. With the spread of new fruits from abroad, citrus peaches, cherries, and eventually tropical imports like pineapples, the medlar seemed old-fashioned and rustic by comparison. By the 18th and 19th centuries, it was already regarded as a curiosity grown in cottage gardens rather than grand estates. Today it survives mainly in specialist orchards and heritage collections, a relic of a bygone culinary world. Yet its legacy remains powerful. The medlar reminds us that not all food is about instant gratification. In a culture accustomed to immediacy, the medlar's message that sweetness comes only with patience and that appearances can deceive feels strikingly relevant. Its paradoxical nature, at once comic and profound, makes it one of the most characterful fruits of the medieval orchard. In the grand story of medieval agriculture, the medlar stands as a symbol of time transformation and truth. Where apples spoke of abundance, pomegranates of fertility, and quinces of refinement, the medlar spoke of life's deeper mysteries, that decay and sweetness are sometimes two sides of the same coin. To eat a medlar was to taste both the humor and the wisdom of the Middle Ages. So while the medlar may be forgotten in modern supermarkets, its role in history is unforgettable. It was the fruit of patience, paradox, and philosophy, a humble brown orb that taught generations of Europeans to look beyond appearances and to wait for sweetness. Among the trees that lined medieval orchards and roadsides, the mulberry morus spp held a position unlike any other. Its berries, dark and sweet when ripe, were valued for food and medicine. But the mulberry's true claim to fame lay not in its fruit, but in its leaves, the essential nourishment of the silkworm. In this way, the mulberry became deeply entwined with medieval trade, luxury, and legend. The mulberry was not native to much of northern Europe. Ancient Rome had already introduced it to the Mediterranean world, where both the black mulberry Morus nigra and the white mulberry Morus alba were known. The latter, originally from China, was indispensable for silk production. Through centuries of contact with Byzantium and later the Islamic world, Europeans became familiar with silk as a fabric of unmatched beauty. Every shimmering robe, every gleaming altar cloth owed its existence to the humble mulberry leaf. For medieval Europeans, silk was a treasure from afar, costly, rare, and loaded with prestige. It was worn by kings, bishops, and nobles. It adorned relics and shrines. It was traded across thousands of miles by merchants who risked deserts and seas. Behind this luxury stood the mulberry, the quiet tree that sustained the silk industry. Though most silk in the Middle Ages was imported, rulers in Italy, Spain, and later France attempted to cultivate their own mulberry groves to feed silkworms. These efforts marked the beginnings of Europe's long, uneven path toward self-sufficient sericulture. But the mulberry was not only about silk. Its berries, when fully ripe, stained fingers, deep purple, offering a tart, sweet taste, beloved by children and peasants alike. In kitchens, the fruit could be eaten fresh, boiled into syrups, fermented into wines, or preserved in honey. Apothecaries valued mulberries for their cooling properties, using them to soothe sore throats, fevers, and inflammations. The juice, rich in tannins, also served as a natural dye and ink, giving the fruit both practical and symbolic importance. In folklore and mythology, the mulberry carried even deeper resonance. The ancient tale of Pyramus and Thisbe, retold by Ovid, explained why the mulberry's fruit turned from white to dark. According to the story, two lovers separated by family opposition planned a secret meeting under a mulberry tree. Through tragic miscommunication, each believed the other dead, and both took their own lives. The gods, pitying them, stained the mulberry fruit red with their blood. Medieval readers who knew this story through Latin texts saw in the mulberry a symbol of love loss and sacrifice. Because of its dual role as both a common fruit and the foundation of luxury silk, the mulberry embodied paradox in medieval life. It was eaten by peasants in hedgerows, yet it also fueled the richest trade networks of the known world. It was a source of rustic stains on children's clothes and of shimmering robes for emperors. In this way, the mulberry bridged two worlds, the humble orchard and the glittering court. The mulberry tree itself was highly regarded for its resilience and usefulness. Hardy and fast-growing, it provided not only fruit and leaves, but also timber, which was prized for its durability and fine grain. Mulberry wood was used in carpentry, musical instruments, and even shipbuilding in certain regions. Farmers appreciated that mulberry trees could thrive in poor soils, making them a valuable addition to village landscapes. Yet it was the association with silk that truly elevated the tree's cultural standing. In the Byzantine Empire, mulberry groves were closely guarded, for silk production was considered a state secret. Legends circulated in Europe about how silk had first arrived. Some said monks smuggled silkworm eggs hidden in hollow canes from China to Byzantium in the 6th century. Others imagined caravans bringing both worms and mulberry saplings along the Silk Road. Whatever the truth, by the High Middle Ages silk was one of the most desired commodities in Europe, commanding enormous prices. The church, too, embraced silk, though often with ambivalence. On one hand, silk garments were seen as symbols of heavenly splendor, suitable for vestments and altar coverings. On the other hand, some preachers condemned silk as a vanity, a temptation to pride and luxury. The mulberry, as the silent provider of this fabric, thus became indirectly tied to debates about morality, wealth, and the proper use of beauty. In literature, the mulberry's role was twofold. Classical myths like Pyramus and Thisbe gave it a tragic romantic aura. But medieval bestiaries and herbal texts focused more on its practical virtues. Physicians praised mulberry syrup for quenching thirst and cooling fevers. In humoral medicine, it was considered cold and dry useful against excessive heat and bile. The fruit's deep staining power also made it a symbol of intensity and permanence, just as its color could not be washed easily from cloth. So too, love, sin, or grief might leave lasting marks on the soul. At a more local level, mulberries were woven into seasonal traditions. In some regions, children sang songs when gathering berries, while villagers used the fruit in rustic wines or cordials. The black mulberry in particular was prized for winemaking, producing a strong, dark drink that could supplement grape harvests. These local practices kept the tree embedded in daily life, even as its connection to silk linked it to distant empires. Thus, the mulberry occupied a unique space in medieval thought. it was at once ordinary and extraordinary. To the villager, it was food shade and a messy delight. To the merchant, it was a gateway to trade and wealth. To the scholar, it was myth and medicine. And to the priest, it was a reminder of the tension between earthly luxury and spiritual humility. By the later Middle Ages, mulberry cultivation was expanding in Europe, particularly in southern regions, where rulers hoped to establish their own silk industries. In Spain, under Muslim rule, and later in Italy, especially in Lucca and Florence, silk weaving became a thriving craft. Mulberry orchards, though not always successful in northern climates, became symbols of ambition and economic power. Planting mulberries meant aspiring to join the great chain of luxury trade that stretched from China to Constantinople to Venice. This expansion gave the mulberry an enduring association with commerce and aspiration. While not every attempt at European silk making succeeded, the idea of cultivating mulberries as a step toward prosperity persisted well into the Renaissance. Even monarchs like James I of England in the 17th century would later plant thousands of mulberries in hopes of establishing silk industries, an echo of medieval dreams. Meanwhile, the mulberry's symbolic role in literature and art continued to flourish. Painters occasionally included mulberry trees in biblical or allegorical scenes, linking their dark fruit to sacrifice, martyrdom, or the blood of Christ. Poets used the fruit as a metaphor for love's intensity or life's fragility. Its ancient mythological roots ensured that it carried connotations of both tragedy and beauty. Culturally, the mulberry reminded medieval people of the interconnectedness of their world. To eat a mulberry in a village orchard was to share in a chain of meaning that extended from local traditions to global trade. The same tree that offered purple-stained fingers in summer also sustained silkworms whose threads clothed emperors. In an age when most people lived within narrow horizons, the mulberry hinted at wider connections, weaving together myth, medicine, and economy. Though silk production in medieval Europe never matched the scale of Asia, the mulberry left a permanent mark. Its berries flavored wines and syrups, its timber-shaped tools and instruments, and its leaves fed generations of silkworms in small but significant experiments. More than this, its image lived on in stories, poems, and seasonal customs, making it one of the most layered fruits of the medieval orchard. In the grand story of medieval fruits, the mulberry stands for interweaving worlds, the rustic and the regal, the local and the global, the humble berry and the priceless cloth. It embodied the very fabric of medieval life, rooted in soil yet reaching toward distant horizons. Thus, the mulberry was not just a fruit, but a symbol of connection, binding the orchard to the marketplace, the village to the empire, and the sweetness of the land to the silken threads of legend. Among the most curious fruits that medieval farmers tended, few are as forgotten today as the sorb apple, also known as the fruit of the service tree, Sorbus domestica. At first glance, the sorb apple resembles a small misshapen apple or pear, but its story is far richer than its odd appearance suggests. In medieval Europe, this fruit carried layers of meaning, culinary, medicinal, and even spiritual, that deserve to be remembered. The service tree itself was rare, scattered across Europe in small groves or standing as solitary trees in fields. Farmers valued it for its longevity and resilience. A service tree could live for centuries, producing fruit long after human generations had passed. This gave it an aura of permanence. In villages, an ancient service tree might be regarded with quiet reverence, a natural monument that witnessed countless harvests, weddings, and funerals. But it was the fruit, the sorb apple, that really fascinated medieval households. Unlike apples or pears, sorb apples were virtually inedible when fresh. Hard, sour, and astringent, they puckered the mouth and were said to bite the tongue. Yet medieval farmers had a clever solution. They bletted the fruit, a process in which the sorb apples were deliberately left to soften and partially rot in straw or on a warm shelf. Over days or weeks, the harsh tannins broke down, transforming the hard fruit into a sweet, mushy delicacy. This transformation gave the sorb apple an almost mystical quality. It was a fruit that had to die to become edible, a striking metaphor in a society steeped in religious symbolism. Monks and priests sometimes used it as an allegory in sermons. Just as the sorb apple must decay before it nourishes, so must the human soul undergo trials, suffering, or humility before reaching true grace. On the table, bletted sorb apples were enjoyed much like a sweetened paste. They were eaten with spoons, spread on bread, or mixed into porridges. The texture was strange, grainy, and soft, with a flavor somewhere between baked apple date and honey. For peasants, it was a welcome burst of sweetness during lean months. For the wealthy, the fruit's rarity made it something of a curiosity to offer at feasts. Beyond eating, sorb apples were famous for their role in brewing. In some regions, they were crushed and fermented into a drink called cormet, a kind of rustic cider. This drink was said to be both refreshing and mildly medicinal. A mug of cormet could steady the stomach, lift the spirits, and provide a safe alternative to contaminated water. The fruit's natural tannins gave the drink a sharp edge, and some chroniclers remarked that it was more wholesome than wine. As humble as it seemed, the sorb apple also had its place in medicine. Herbalists prescribed it for diarrhea, fevers, and sore throats, praising its binding qualities. Dried sorb apples could be carried as a remedy during long journeys, a portable cure for unsettled stomachs. Physicians in medieval towns sometimes recommended them to balance the humors, especially when too much choleric heat was thought to cause illness. In sum, the sorb apple was no ordinary fruit. It was a food of paradoxes, inedible, yet nourishing, decayed, yet life-giving, humble, yet rare. And for medieval farmers who cultivated it, this strangeness only deepened its value. The presence of sorb apples in medieval life also reveals much about the ingenuity of rural farmers. Unlike mainstream orchard fruits, sorb apples were slow to mature. A newly planted service tree could take decades before bearing significant harvests. For this reason, planting one was an act of faith, a gift to future generations. In fact, in some regions, it became a tradition for families to plant a service tree at the birth of a child, believing that by the time the child reached adulthood, the tree would begin to yield fruit. This patience reinforced the tree's association with heritage and continuity. Medieval chronicles sometimes described noble estates, boasting ancient service trees that had stood for centuries, lending prestige to the landowners. Yet even peasant cottages might be graced by a single tree, its yearly offering of Sorb apples becoming a seasonal ritual. In terms of culinary creativity, medieval cooks turned the Sorb apple's limitations into virtues. Recipes from monastic kitchens describe stews thickened with Sorb paste, pastries filled with bletted fruit, and sauces paired with fatty meats like pork or goose. The fruit's tart sweet complexity acted much like a medieval version of chutney, balancing richness with acidity. But the greatest fame of the Sorb apple lay in its beverages. Corme, the fermented drink made from the fruit, had a unique status in medieval society. Unlike beer, which was tied to barley harvests, or wine, which required extensive vineyards, Corme could be brewed in smaller households. Some abbeys even developed reputations for their fine Corme, which they sold to pilgrims and travelers. In rural markets, it was common for jugs of Sorb apple drink to be exchanged alongside cider ale and mead. The fruit also crept into ritual and folklore. Because it had to decay to be enjoyed, it became a symbol of transformation and hidden potential. In some folk tales, Sorb apples were gifted to heroes at critical moments, granting them unexpected strength or wisdom. In Celtic tradition, remnants of which survived into medieval storytelling, the service tree was believed to ward off evil spirits. A sprig of its leaves hung in a home was thought to protect against curses or misfortune. There were even whispers of Sorb apples being used in love charms. Young women might slip a bletted Sorb apple into a suitor's pocket, symbolizing hidden sweetness beneath a rough exterior. The fruit's odd wrinkled appearance perhaps made it a fitting metaphor for the unpredictability of love. Despite their uses, Sorb apples were never widely cultivated, compared to apples, pears, or plums. Their slow growth and awkward texture kept them on the fringes of medieval horticulture. Yet this very rarity lent them prestige. To offer Sorb apples at a feast was to signal refinement, curiosity, and an embrace of the unusual. Chroniclers describe noble banquets where bowls of Sorb apples sat alongside dates, figs, and other exotic imports. Unlike those imports, however, Sorb apples were native treasures grown on local soil. The dual identity of the Sorb apple as both a peasant's comfort food and a nobleman's delicacy makes it one of the most intriguing of medieval fruits. It was a bridge across classes, uniting monks, farmers, lords, and healers in their appreciation of its peculiar virtues. As the medieval world transitioned into the Renaissance, and beyond the service tree and its fruit began to fade from prominence, new trade routes brought in a dazzling array of exotic fruits, citrus from the Mediterranean, peaches from Persia, and even early shipments of tropical produce. Compared to these vibrant novelties, the wrinkled, bletted Sorb apple seemed outdated and rustic. Urban markets increasingly favored fruits that could be transported, easily stored, without spoiling, and presented attractively on stalls. Sorb apples, with their need for controlled rotting and their fragile texture, simply did not fit this model. What had once been cherished as a seasonal gift of nature came to be seen as impractical. By the 17th and 18th centuries, Corme was rare, and the fruit was cultivated only in isolated villages or monastic gardens. Yet remnants of its cultural importance lingered. In some rural areas, sorb apples remained tied to folk remedies well into the modern era. Old herbal manuals still listed them as cures for stomach complaints. In France and parts of Germany, rustic cormet continued to be brewed for local festivals, though often more as a nostalgic custom than a staple. Today, the sorb apple is largely forgotten, overshadowed by its more glamorous cousins. But it has not disappeared entirely. Scattered across Europe, ancient service trees still stand, some of them estimated to be over 500 years old. In autumn, their branches still drop wrinkled fruit onto the ground unnoticed by most passers-by. Yet for those who pause to taste, the experience remains almost exactly what it was for medieval farmers, the strange sweetness of a fruit that ripens only through decay. The sorb apple deserves a revival, not just for its novelty, but for what it represents. In an age where food is often about convenience and uniformity, the sorb apple reminds us of an older rhythm of patience, transformation, and respect for the hidden gifts of nature. Imagine once again planting service trees, knowing they will outlive us, offering fruit for generations yet unborn. Such was the mindset of medieval farmers, and such could be ours again. In the grand tapestry of forgotten medieval fruits, the sorb apple occupies a unique place. It was never the most abundant, the easiest to eat, or the flashiest. But it carried within it profound lessons about resilience, patience, and the beauty of imperfection. It was in a sense the philosopher's fruit, teaching through its very nature that sweetness often comes only after hardship. To rediscover the sorb apple today is to reconnect with that medieval wisdom. Perhaps just as monks and peasants once did, we too can find delight in this humble wrinkled gift of the service tree. If there is any fruit that encapsulates the strange, the overlooked, and the misunderstood in medieval Europe, it is undoubtedly the Medlar, Misspylus germanica. Known in the Middle Ages as the open arse fruit due to its unusual shape, the Medlar occupied a peculiar position, mocked in literature yet treasured in kitchens. A symbol of decay, yet a source of life in the harshest months of the year. The Medlar does not fit our modern idea of fruit. It is not juicy like a pear, nor crisp like an apple. Instead, it is small, brown, and wrinkled-looking, more like something past its prime than freshly harvested. But that is precisely the point. Medlars were deliberately eaten when they were overripe and softened, a process known as bletting. After being picked in late autumn, they were stored in cool, dark places until their flesh became soft, sweet, and spreadable almost like a natural jam. In an age without sugar, this transformation made the medlar extraordinary. Other fruits had to be preserved with honey or cooked into compotes, but the medlar ripened into sweetness all on its own. For medieval households especially, during the bleak weeks between late autumn and Christmas, medlars were a rare treat, a winter fruit that seemed to defy the season of scarcity. Writers noticed this peculiarity and often gave the medlar metaphorical weight. Geoffrey Chaucer in the Canterbury Tales compared old age to the medlar ripe only when rotten, Shakespeare later echoed this sentiment, using the medlar as a bawdy symbol of lust and decay in plays like Romeo and Juliet. To medieval readers and audiences, these references were immediately recognizable. Everyone knew the fruit. Everyone knew its associations. But beyond the jokes and metaphors, medlars were practical. Their unique ripening process meant they could be kept for weeks, even months, providing a reliable food source deep into winter. The taste described as somewhere between spiced applesauce and dates was unlike anything else available to peasants or nobles. It could be eaten plain with bread or mashed and added to warm ale, transforming simple drinks into seasonal luxuries. To understand the role of the medlar in medieval life, one must picture the seasonal rhythms of farming families. By November, most orchards were bare. Apples had been pressed into cider pears stored in cellars and plums dried for the winter. Fresh fruit was virtually gone, except for the medlar hanging stubbornly on the branch long after frosts had stripped other trees. Farmers would harvest them late, often after the first snow, and tuck them away in straw or wooden crates to soften. This endurance gave the medlar a certain magical reputation. People believed its ability to ripen in the dead of winter carried symbolic lessons: patience, endurance, and the idea that sweetness can emerge from hardship. Some monasteries cultivated medlars in cloister gardens, not only for food, but for the allegorical lessons they provided monks during sermons and scriptural study. The fruit's medicinal uses also earned it a place in medieval herbals. Physicians and apothecaries prescribed medlar flesh as a cure for stomach troubles, diarrhea, and fevers. The seeds, when ground, were believed to ease kidney stones and bladder ailments. Medlar syrup was considered cooling, useful for treating excessive heat in the body, according to humoral theory. In a world where medicine and diet blurred together, the medlar was both sustenance and remedy. Its versatility extended to the kitchen as well. Wealthier households experimented with medlars in pies, tarts, and sauces. Combined with spices like cinnamon, cloves, and ginger, luxuries imported from the East. The medlar became a fruit worthy of the noble table. A medlar tart served at a winter feast was not merely food, but a statement the host had access to both rare spices and the patience to prepare a fruit considered unusual, yet refined. Yet even among peasants, medlars were not rare. The trees were hardy, resistant to poor soils and frosts, making them an accessible crop in many parts of Europe. Unlike figs or oranges, which required trade, medlars grew in the same hedgerows and orchards that sheltered apples and pears. Their commonness, however, combined with their odd ripening, ensured they were often considered a fruit of contrasts: lowly yet noble, coarse yet delicate, humorous yet essential. The decline of the medlar began not because it lost value, but because the fruit world around it changed. By the late medieval and early Renaissance period, Europe's access to new fruits expanded dramatically. Citrus from the Mediterranean, cherries from Eastern Europe, and later exotic imports like pineapples and bananas began to overshadow the humble medlar. Compared to these vibrant, juicy newcomers, the wrinkled brown medlar seemed outdated, almost embarrassing. Cultural perception also shifted. What was once a clever metaphor for patience and ripeness became increasingly associated with decay and rot. Writers leaned into the bawdy, mocking side of the fruit, turning it into a punchline rather than a delicacy. By the 17th and 18th centuries, the medlar was falling out of fashion in noble circles, remembered more for its jokes than for its taste. Yet for hundreds of years, the medlar had been a quiet pillar of survival. It bridged the gap between autumn's bounty and the deep hunger of late winter. It provided sweetness when sugar was rare and medicine when pharmacies were unknown. Its very existence challenged the rhythms of scarcity, offering a reminder that nature still had gifts even in the darkest months. Today, the medlar is almost forgotten. A few orchards in England, France, and Germany still cultivate it, but most people would not recognize the fruit if they saw it. And yet, in a time when interest in heritage foods and forgotten flavors is rising, the medlar seems poised for rediscovery. Its unusual taste, its historical symbolism, and its resilience in poor soils make it a candidate for revival among gardeners, chefs, and historians alike. The story of the medlar reminds us that history is full of quiet survivors' fruits, like people that thrive not by dazzling in their prime, but by enduring hardship and transforming decay into nourishment. In the medieval world, no fruit embodied that paradox more fully than the medlar. When we look back at the 15 forgotten fruits of the medieval world, we are not just studying food, we are uncovering a window into survival culture and identity. Each of these fruits tells a story about how people endured scarcity, celebrated abundance, and found meaning in the cycles of nature. The quince symbolized romance and fertility, while the damson plum tied humble orchards to global trade. The barberry carried both healing power and superstition. The service tree quietly sustained villages with fruit that lasted through winter, just as the Sorb apple and Rowan berry guarded against hunger and illness. Even the mulberry, once linked with silk and wealth, was also a food for peasants. These fruits were not just nourishment. They were metaphors, medicines, and cultural anchors. The Cornelian cherry-flavored feasts, the slow strengthened bodies, and the medlar odd and wrinkled reminded people that sweetness can emerge from decay. Together, they reveal a medieval world deeply attuned to the seasons, where nothing was wasted, and where food carried lessons about patience, resilience, and community. Today, most of these fruits have been replaced by globalized crops: bananas, oranges, supermarket apples. Yet in their disappearance, something was lost: flavors that connected people to their land, and traditions that gave food symbolic depth. Reviving these forgotten fruits is not only about taste, but about remembering a way of life where survival depended on knowing the gifts of every tree and hedge. In the end, the medieval orchard teaches us a timeless truth: that diversity, endurance, and adaptability are the keys to survival. And perhaps by rediscovering these fruits, we can also rediscover a little of that wisdom for ourselves.